All right, whether you're lying in bed, driving through the night, making dinner, powering through emails, or quietly working with your headphones on, welcome. This is Sleepless Homo, a channel for sapiens who can't stop wondering how we ended up like this. From extinction to empires, stone tools to space probe, this is the story of us. If this kind of long-form, fact-driven storytelling keeps you company, whether you use it to fall asleep, to focus, to survive another shift, or to fill the background while cooking, let me know in the comments. How do you use this? Before bed, during work, somewhere in between? And if this helps, if you like learning like this, you can like the video, subscribe to the channel, and maybe share it. Not just because it feeds the algorithm, but because it helps more people stumble across this kind of content. A little quieter, a little slower, built for minds that are still hungry, even at 2 a.m. All right, let's get into it. It is strange to imagine, but the first face that truly looked human was not staring into a fire, not carving symbols, not wondering why the stars moved the way they did. They were not painting caves or wearing beads or telling stories about the shape of the world. They were simply alive, walking, hunting, gathering, surviving. And yet, if you passed one of them on the street today, dressed them in a decent hoodie, gave them a haircut, you wouldn't notice anything strange. No hunched posture, no brow ridges, no sloping skull, just a person. Homo sapiens. You, me, almost. The place was Jebel Irhoud, Morocco. The year was somewhere around 315,000 years ago. At the time, it was not desert as it is now. The Sahara pulsed between dry and green across millennia, and back then it was a rich grassland home to gazelle, zebra, rhinos, and humans, or at least, the early shape of us. The discovery itself was an accident. In 1954, miners looking for barite unearthed a skull. They thought it was something recent, maybe a Berber ancestor. It wasn't. Decades later, detailed excavations revealed not just one skull, but multiple remains, adults, children, and stone tools scattered around what appeared to be an ancient hunting camp. For years, the dating was a mess. People guessed maybe 40,000, maybe 70,000. Then, in 2017, thermoluminescence dating of the stone tools and electron spin resonance dating of the teeth finally locked it in. Not 70,000, not 150,000, but roughly 315,000 years old. The skulls were a puzzle. The face looked unmistakably modern. A flat face, tucked-in cheekbones, a rounded jawline. If you reconstructed the soft tissue, it looks eerily familiar. But then you step back and the brain case was not. Elongated, more archaic, not the globular, rounded skull that modern humans have today. In essence, the face arrived first. The brain, or rather the shape of the brain, would catch up later. But here's the problem. The bones tell one story. The world around those bones tells another. There was no art, no beads, no grave goods, no sign of symbolic behavior. These people were making Middle Stone Age tools, pointed flakes, scrapers, spear tips, excellent craftsmanship, sophisticated even, but no signs of the symbolic revolution that would come tens of thousands of years later. They were biologically human, but behaviorally something else, something quieter, something missing. And that is the haunting question. Why? Why were the first Homo sapiens so empty of what we consider human? They had the same hands capable of delicate movement, the same vocal tract as far as we can tell, capable of speech, the same eyes looking out onto a landscape full of meaning, but no symbols, no myths, no records, no evidence of imagination made physical. They were surviving, yes, thriving perhaps, but not yet storytelling. The Jebel Irhoud fossils are the oldest known remains attributed to Homo sapiens. But they were not a singular population. They were not the first people in the sense that a single birthplace led to all of us. What the evidence increasingly shows is that our species emerged not from one location, but from a network of populations scattered across Africa, exchanging genes, knowledge, and survival strategies over tens of thousands of years. The so-called weakly structured stem model suggests that around 1.5 million years ago, a common ancestor split into at least two populations within Africa. Those groups remained separated long enough to develop distinct genetic lineages but continued to interbreed occasionally. Then, sometime around 300,000 years ago, those lineages fused back together. Homo sapiens was not born from a single point, but from a tangled braid of ancestry. And yet, no matter how tangled the genetics, the archaeological record still stares back blankly. For hundreds of thousands of years after Jebel Irhoud, there is almost nothing in the way of art. No musical instruments, no engraved stones, no figurines, nothing that looks like religion or myth or narrative. They made tools, they hunted, they ate, they raised children. But did they wonder? Did they dream? If they did, they left no record of it. Some anthropologists argue that this is not entirely fair, that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, that most early human culture was probably made of materials that do not survive: wood, fiber, feathers, plant dyes. It is entirely possible that these people were weaving baskets, carving wooden idols, painting their skin with ochre, or telling stories under the stars, none of which would survive 300,000 years of erosion, wind, rain, and time. But even so, the contrast is stark. Compare it to what happens 50,000 years ago, an explosion of cave art, beads, musical instruments, elaborate burials, mythologies etched into stone, bone, and pigment. Whatever was happening at Jebel Irhoud was a different kind of humanity, a quieter one, a flatter one. The tools tell a partial story. The Middle Stone Age toolkit was already a leap beyond the Acheulean hand axes used by Homo erectus and other archaic humans. The Jebel Irhoud people were making prepared core tools, meaning they shaped a stone so that flakes could be struck off in predictable shapes. They had pointed spear tips, scrapers for processing hides, and blades that could be hafted onto wooden shafts. This is not crude technology. This is engineering. This is thinking several steps ahead. And yet, still no symbols, no decoration, no ornamentation, nothing in the grave, no sense that a body was anything more than a carcass. This is the paradox of the first Homo sapiens: modern bodies, ancient minds, or maybe not ancient, maybe simply unexpressed. A mind like yours, capable of imagination, but not yet organized in the way that would externalize that imagination into objects. There are theories, of course. One argues that the architecture of the brain was not yet fully wired for symbolic thought, that the shape of the Jebel Irhoud brain, more elongated, less globular, reflects a different neuroanatomy that delayed the emergence of recursion, abstraction, and symbolic meaning. Others argue that it was not about the brain at all, but about the environment. Small, scattered populations under constant ecological stress may simply not have had the luxury to build complex cultures. When survival is precarious, there is less room for art. Another hypothesis is the demography model. Innovation, especially symbolic culture, only emerges when populations are large enough to maintain and transmit it. A brilliant idea in a group of 30 people can disappear if that person dies before teaching it to someone else. Language, myth, memory, all these are fragile in small populations. They depend on numbers, on networks, on interconnection. And there is the most haunting theory of all. Maybe the mind was ready. Maybe the capacity for myth, for meaning, for dreaming was already there, but they simply did not yet have the need to express it outwardly. Maybe the interior world was private. Maybe they imagined, but they never carved it into bone. It raises a strange, unsettling question about what we think culture is. Is it inevitable that humans create symbols, or is it contingent, requiring just the right set of pressures, opportunities, and social structures to emerge? Because if it is contingent, then it means humanity, as we recognize it today, not biological humanity but symbolic humanity, could have never happened. The world could have been full of people who looked exactly like us but never painted, never told stories, never asked why. People who hunted, ate, slept, bred, died, but never left a record of what they believed. And that is the silence we are staring into at Jebel Irhoud. Fossils that look like us, brains that were almost us, but not yet the fire of story, not yet the explosion of meaning, not yet the world of ancestors and myths and spirits and futures. Not yet. But it was coming. Somewhere, sometime, something was beginning to stir. The question that hovers over this entire story, The question that will haunt us from the first frame to the last is simple. Why then? Why, only 50,000 years ago, did the silence finally break? The strange thing about the human story is that it did not begin once. It began, and then it began again, and then it began again. The more archaeologists dig into the deep past of our species, the more it becomes clear that there was no clean starting line. No single day when the first Homo sapiens opened their eyes and stepped forward into history as we know it. Instead, what we find are scattered pieces of a very strange puzzle. A face here, a skull there, tools in one place, symbols in another. Some pieces fit, some refuse to. And the biggest question that haunts all of it is this. If Homo sapiens, the anatomical blueprint of us, existed all across Africa more than 250,000 years ago, why did it take so long for culture to catch fire? If Jebel Irhoud gives us the oldest recognizable faces, other sites offer the rest of the anatomy. Florisbad, Omo Kabish, Herto, names that represent the ghost cities of deep time, places where bones surfaced from the earth to remind us that we have been here for a very long time. Begin with Florisbad, South Africa. The year is approximately 260,000 years ago. The fossil is partial, a skull, fragments, a brow ridge, some teeth. But what it tells us is that a human face, essentially modern, was already staring out onto the grasslands of southern Africa long before the supposed behavioral revolution ever arrived. Florisbad is a strange one. The skull has a flat face and rounded cheeks like us, but an enormous brain case, larger than many modern humans. Yet that brain sat inside a head that retained some archaic features, a mosaic, half modern, half ancient. The stone tools found there are Middle Stone Age, efficient, sophisticated, but purely functional. No symbols, no ornaments, no graves. Move now to Ethiopia, the Kibish Formation along the Omo River. The date is somewhere between 205,000 and 195,000 years ago. Here we find Omo Prurs, the oldest fossil that is fully, unmistakably Homo sapiens. A modern skull, a high forehead, a chin, the anatomical feature that is almost exclusively human, a rounded brain case. If you scanned this skull and placed it in a modern hospital CT, no red flags would pop up. This was us, entirely. But once again, no art, no beads, no carved bones, just tools. And even those tools were conservative. Points, scrapers, flakes, the same types that had been circulating for tens of thousands of years. Then Herto, also Ethiopia, around 160,000 years ago. Here we find a family, 2 adults, 1 child. Their skulls are fully Homo sapiens, but with some robust archaic traits. Big brow ridges, larger teeth, thick bones, enough that some anthropologists labeled them a subspecies, Homo sapiens idaltu, elder, as if to mark them as almost, but not quite, us. But this is where the mystery deepens. The Herto site gives us one of the earliest hints of something more. The skull of the child shows signs of being deliberately modified after death, carefully cut marks, likely from defleshing or ritual processing. Was this cannibalism, a mortuary practice, an early form of ancestor worship? We do not know. But it is the first whisper that the minds who made these cuts were not just thinking about life, but about death and what comes after. Step back now and look at the pattern. Between 300,000 and 150,000 years ago, Homo sapiens was not a single population expanding from one cradle. It was a network, a braided stream. Populations scattered across the continent from Morocco to South Africa to Ethiopia to Tanzania, evolving in semi-isolation but still occasionally sharing genes, tools, and perhaps ideas. The genetic evidence supports this. A tangled web of lineages within Africa, groups splitting, mixing, diverging, rejoining. No tree, a braided river. And yet, the behavioral record is stubbornly flat. These were people with modern bodies, capable hands, vocal tracts capable of complex speech, brain sizes equivalent to or even larger than ours today. And yet, no cave paintings, no musical instruments, no bone flutes, no ivory figurines. For nearly 250,000 years, silence. Why? One theory argues it was environmental pressure. or the lack of it. When populations are small and the climate is stable, there is little selective pressure for innovation. If the world does not demand change, culture does not change. Small groups living in relatively stable habitats do not need to invent complex myths or advanced tools. They simply rely on what works. Another theory looks to demographics. Culture is not just a product of intelligence. It is a product of memory. And memory requires networks. A single genius can invent something, but if their community is too small, that knowledge vanishes when they die. This is what scientists call cultural drift, the random loss of information in small populations. A new hunting technique, a new story, a new ritual, all can evaporate in one generation if the group is too tiny to sustain it. Then there is the neurological hypothesis, that the shape of the brain itself was still evolving. While the brain size of early Homo sapiens was equal to ours, the shape was not. The Jebel-Irhoud skulls show an elongated brain case, more like earlier hominins. The fully globular brain, the round, compact brain shape of modern humans, does not consistently show up until after 100,000 years ago. Some neuroscientists argue that this globularization reflects internal rewiring that supports complex language, recursion, and symbolic thought. If true, it means that the hardware for myth and metaphor was still under construction. But there is another, more unsettling possibility. Maybe the spark was already there. Maybe humans had all the necessary tools for culture, for art, for language, for religion, but simply did not use them. Not because they could not, but because they did not need to. Consider this. The San hunter-gatherers of southern Africa, one of the oldest continuous cultures on Earth, encode vast amounts of ecological knowledge into song, story, and ritual. But those traditions only become necessary in societies that prioritize memory over material storage. In a world where everything you need is available in your immediate landscape, water, food, shelter, the incentive to create complex external symbols might be lower. Your knowledge lives in your body, in your muscle memory, in your group's oral tradition, not in paint, not in beads, not in stone. Add to this the brutal impermanence of the archaeological record. 99% of human material culture was made of things that do not survive: fiber, wood, skin, plant dyes, singing voices, stories told around a fire, all of it gone. It is entirely possible that early Homo sapiens were deeply symbolic beings whose culture was simply made of things the earth does not keep, or perhaps not. Perhaps the mind had not yet turned inward in the way that defines us today. Perhaps death was still just death. The stars were just lights. The wind was just the wind. The boundary between existence and meaning had not yet been breached. Because when you look across the sites, Jebel-Irhoud, Florisbad, Omo Kibish, Herto, the pattern holds. Modern bodies, functional tools, maybe a hint here and there of something more, but the spark never quite catches. Not yet. Not fully. And that is the haunting tension that defines the first 100,000 years of Homo sapiens. The pieces were on the table. The hand, the brain, the voice. But the pattern did not yet emerge. The fire did not yet spread. So the question remains, what were they waiting for? Was it the right environment, the right population size, a neurological tipping point, a cognitive accident? Or were they simply living a kind of humanity that did not yet require myth? Either way, the fuse was laid, the conditions were forming, and something was coming. The question that drives the entire rest of this story still hangs in the air. Why then? Why, 50,000 years ago, did everything finally change? By the time the world turned somewhere between 250,000 and 200,000 years ago, the human blueprint was fully in place. The bones, the hands, the brain, the vocal tract, the upright gait. Homo sapiens was not a promise of the future anymore. We were here, walking, hunting, building. The machinery of the mind was fully assembled. And yet, something was missing. Because when you scan the archaeological record of this period, the pattern is maddening. The technology is remarkable. The symbolic footprint is almost entirely blank. This is the era archaeologists call the Middle Stone Age. It marks a technological shift as dramatic as the invention of the smartphone, only stretched across tens of thousands of years. The old Acheulean hand axe tradition, which had dominated for more than 1.5 million years, was fading. In its place, precision. Standardized flake tools, stone points shaped carefully, often symmetrical, and more importantly, composite tools. For the first time, humans were combining materials into complex instruments. Hafted spears, stone points mounted onto wooden shafts with plant resin and sinew bindings. A hunting weapon orders of magnitude more effective than anything used before. Look to the site of Kathu Pan in South Africa. Here, archaeologists unearthed stone spear tips dating back to about 500,000 years ago. But by 250,000 years ago, the process was refined into an art form of engineering. These were not random shards lashed onto sticks. They were designed. The stone was heat-treated, carefully flaked, the edges straightened, the tips narrowed to precise aerodynamic forms. And then, fire. One of the most underestimated technologies in this period is the controlled use of heat, not just for cooking, but for transforming stone itself. At Pinnacle Point, a coastal site in what is now South Africa, humans discovered that heating silkrete, a form of stone, made it easier to flake, producing sharper, more reliable tools. This was not guesswork. This was an applied science, a deliberate understanding of materials, temperature, and fracture mechanics. Heat the rock too little, and it remains brittle. Heat it too much, and it cracks uselessly. Get it right, and the rock transforms. Suddenly it flakes like glass. This knowledge did not emerge randomly. It had to be observed, tested, repeated, taught, which means they were watching the world closely. They were capable of transmitting subtle information across generations. They were paying attention, and yet, the silence. Because alongside all this growing technological sophistication, we still see none of the symbolic hallmarks of later Homo sapiens. No cave paintings, no musical instruments, no figurines, no evidence of ritual burial. They had mastered fire to transform stone. They had mastered wood, sinew, and resin to create weapons that extended the power of the human body by an order of magnitude. They hunted in coordinated groups. They harvested shellfish from the coasts. They made shelters, gathered medicinal plants, possibly even made bedding, and yet, they did not yet carve the world into symbols. Consider ochre, one of the oldest pigments in human history. At the site of Rhino Cave in Botswana and Blombos Cave in South Africa, archaeologists have found pieces of ochre with grind marks dated to over 200,000 years ago. The ochre was not simply collected, it was modified, ground, mixed, turned into powder. For what? The most conservative guess is purely functional, perhaps as an insect repellent, as modern hunter-gatherers sometimes use it, or as a skin conditioner, or as an antibacterial. But was it more? Did they mark their bodies with it? Did they draw? Did they signal identity, status, or kinship through color? The problem is, the evidence ends at the tool. We find the ochre, we see the grinding, we know it was being prepared, but we cannot see how it was used. If it was painted onto skin, onto wood, onto hide, it is long gone. If it was painted onto rock, those rocks have not survived or were never used. If it was part of a ritual, the ritual left no trace. It is the eternal frustration of deep time. You can read the recipe, but the meal is gone. It is tempting to believe that the presence of ochre is the seed of symbolism, that it was already happening, that culture was already stirring. But the contrast with what happens much later, 40,000, 50,000 years ago, is still sharp. Later, we get clear patterns, beads, carvings, abstract geometric designs, entire walls of caves painted with animals, spirits, and mythological maps of meaning. But here, the ochre sits mute. Even the hunting strategies of this era tell us that the brains were running far ahead of the culture. At sites like Klassie's River mouth and Pinnacle Point, there is evidence of systematic shellfish harvesting. This may sound small. It is not. Shellfish harvesting requires precise knowledge of tides, seasons, and ecological patterns. It means groups stayed in one place long enough to exploit predictable resources. It means planning. Elsewhere, we find evidence of trap hunting, driving animals into natural bottlenecks or over cliffs. This is not the brute force hunting of earlier hominins. This is strategy, communication, anticipation of animal behavior, perhaps even the use of decoys or coordinated ambushes. So the question repeats like a drumbeat through the Middle Stone Age. How can minds capable of this level of planning, engineering, and environmental manipulation remain mute in the symbolic record? Why is there no art, no myth, no markers of memory made permanent? Some researchers propose that the problem is not cognitive but demographic. This is the demographic ratchet theory. Culture does not scale in a vacuum. It scales in networks. And Africa in this period was vast. Human populations were thinly spread. Genetic evidence suggests that during some periods the entire global population of Homo sapiens may have numbered fewer than 10,000 breeding individuals. That is the size of a small town. A single drought, a single epidemic, a single conflict could erase entire lineages. In such a world, it is easy for information to vanish, for culture to reset, for myths to dissolve back into silence. Another line of thought challenges the assumption that symbolic behavior always has to take material form. Perhaps the problem is not that they were not thinking symbolically. Perhaps the problem is that we are searching for the wrong kinds of evidence. Imagine a culture where memory is not externalized into objects but internalized into practice, where knowledge is encoded into song, movement, seasonal rituals, but never carved into bone or painted onto stone. In such a world, meaning exists, but the earth does not preserve it. There is also the unsettling possibility that the explosion of symbolism was never inevitable, that culture is not simply the automatic product of a big brain, that it required something else, a tipping point, a cultural mutation, or perhaps an accident of history, the right environment, the right density of groups, the right pressures, and suddenly, the world shifts from practical to symbolic, from tool to totem. What is clear is that the technological ceiling was already rising. This period marks the first consistent use of pressure flaking, a method of shaping stone not by hammer blows but by applying precise, directed pressure with bone or antler tools. This produces thinner, sharper, more reliable blades. The leap from hitting a rock with another rock to understanding microfracture propagation is enormous. It requires a mental model of how materials behave. It means humans were not simply reacting to the environment. They were predicting it, manipulating it. And yet, the tools do not speak. The shelters do not speak. The spears do not speak. For nearly 50,000 years, from 250,000 to 200,000 years ago, humanity sat in this strange liminal space, fully human in form, astonishing in technological capacity, masters of fire, of stone, of wood, hunters who could reshape the landscape, but still, no permanent record of myth, no fingerprints of the sacred, no glimpse of the mind turned outward into symbol. It is like watching a fire being prepared. The tinder is laid, the kindling is stacked, sparks flicker, but the flames never catch. Not yet. And so the question that threads through every excavation, every fossil, every stone tool pulled from the earth is this. Why then? Why, only 50,000 years ago, did the fire finally leap into life? By the time the world stood somewhere between 250,000 and 200,000 years ago, the question hanging over our species was no longer about survival. It was about silence. Because when you look at the bones of these early Homo sapiens, when you measure the brow ridges, the cranial vaults, the pelvic tilt, what stares back at you is us, fully human. Not a prototype, not a missing link, not some halfway step in the evolutionary staircase. The skulls have our shape, the hands have our precision, the vocal tract is tuned for language, the brain volume sits comfortably in the same range as ours today. And yet, something is missing. Not in the flesh, not in the tools, but in the mind. This is the haunting paradox of the Middle Stone Age. Because as the stone blades get sharper, the spears get straighter, and the fires get hotter, the symbolic record stays eerily blank. The technology marches forward. The mind, as far as we can tell, stays quiet. Look at the sights. Look at what we find. At Pinnacle Point in South Africa, humans were heat-treating stone as early as 164,000 years ago. This is chemistry, not instinct. This is a recipe that involves gathering firewood, controlling temperature, knowing which stones fracture properly when heated and which shatter. A mistake here doesn't just ruin a tool, it ruins the entire process. This is laboratory-level thinking embedded in a Paleolithic world. Or take the evidence from Sibudu Cave, whereby around 200,000 years ago humans were making compound adhesives. Yes, glue, not a joke. They were grinding red ochre powder and mixing it with plant resin to create a weatherproof, durable binding material for hafting stone blades onto wooden shafts. Modern experimental archaeologists have tried to replicate this process. It requires the precise control of fire, humidity, and ingredient ratios. Too much resin and it becomes brittle. Too much ochre and it won't set. This is not trial and error. This is engineering, cognitive planning, mental models of material properties. And yet, still, no art, no statues, no painted walls, no carved bone flutes or ritual burials with grave goods. The hands are busy. The minds are sharp. The landscapes are reshaped by fire, hunting strategies, and resource management. But the symbolic world, the interior world, leaves no trace. Or worse, it never existed yet. This is the mystery of the missing mind. It is not that the people of this time were cognitively incapable. The neuroanatomy is clear. By 200,000 years ago, the brain was fully Homo sapiens in both size and likely in functional potential. But cognition is not just hardware, it is software, and the software seems to lag. There are many theories. Some propose it is simply an artifact of the archaeological record. That symbolism was already there, but expressed in materials that do not survive. Body painting, tattooing, skin garments with decorations, dance, song, oral storytelling. The wind carries it all away. The dirt preserves none of it. If that is true, then the absence we see is an illusion, a failure of preservation, not of imagination. But if it is not, if the silence is real, then we are looking at a species that was technically sophisticated, ecologically brilliant, socially complex, and yet not yet fully symbolic. And that is where the gap deepens. Because technology alone is not culture. It is easy to project our modern minds backward and assume that a spear represents more than a tool, that it might represent status, ritual, meaning. But the reality may be colder. The spear might simply be a spear. No stories, no myths, no spirits, just wood, stone, resin, the practical machinery of survival. The anthropologist Nicholas Kennard once described the transition to symbolic behavior as a cognitive threshold, a point where the mind stops seeing the world purely in terms of things and starts seeing it in terms of symbols. A feather stops being just insulation. It becomes identity. A red pigment stops being just an insect repellent. It becomes blood, or power, or luck, or lineage. And yet here, between 250,000 and 200,000 years ago, the threshold remains stubbornly uncrossed. Why? Some argue the answer is scale. Technological knowledge can pass through very small populations. One hunter learns how to pressure flake a stone, and if he teaches his children, the technique survives. But symbolic systems, language, myth, religion, require networks. They require redundancy. If one storyteller dies, the story must still live in others. If a ritual is forgotten by one group, another group preserves it. Culture scales through redundancy, not singular genius. The genetic evidence supports this problem. During this time, Homo sapiens populations were astonishingly small. Genetic bottleneck models suggest that during certain periods the global human population may have dropped below 10,000. Small, scattered bands, weeks or months of travel between groups. Information loss becomes almost inevitable. It is not just a theoretical problem. We see it today. Isolated communities whose languages vanish within a single generation. Oral histories lost when a single elder passes away. Rituals fading when a single practitioner dies without an apprentice. Cultural drift is real. It is a form of entropy. Then there is the ecological argument. The African continent in this era was a patchwork of fluctuating climates, hyper-arid deserts, dense rainforests, expanding and contracting grasslands. In a world where survival is an endless negotiation with drought, flood, famine, and fire, the pressure to invest cognitive energy into abstract symbolism may be low. Every mental calorie goes toward finding water, locating prey, avoiding predators, reading the landscape. The spiritual world can wait. But can it? Is technology enough if nobody remembers the stories? This question haunts the bones of our ancestors, because tools without culture are just tools. Knowledge without memory is just utility. It does not cross generations as meaning. It does not become myth. It does not become identity. And yet, the signs begin to stir. At the site of Border Cave, high in the Lobombo Mountains straddling South Africa and Eswatini, archaeologists found evidence of plant bedding dating back nearly 200,000 years. Not just branches laid on the ground, but aromatic leaves chosen for their insect-repellent properties. This is chemistry. This is comfort engineering. This is the domestication of sleep. At the same site, fragments of ostrich eggshells suggest the earliest use of water containers. This is not trivial. Water transport changes everything. It allows for extended hunts, wider migrations, and settlement patterns no longer chained to rivers or springs. But even here, the symbolic silence holds. There are no carvings on the shells, no painted designs, just the practical transformation of matter into utility. At some point between 250,000 and 200,000 years ago, humanity stood on the threshold of itself. The bones were ready, the hands were ready, the brain was wired. And yet the ghost of the modern mind refuses to appear in the dirt. It is as though we stood at the edge of a cliff, staring into the idea of being human, but did not yet leap. What held us back? Was it numbers? Was it environment? Was it chance? Or was it that the human mind does not automatically invent myth, but requires a kind of spark, a convergence of density, memory, and necessity? Because here is the reality. A spear can kill a buffalo. A fire can cook meat. A shelter can keep out the cold. But only a story can survive 1,000 generations. And so the haunting question remains, is technology enough if nobody remembers the stories? The spark had not yet caught, but the wood was dry. The winds were beginning to change, because something was coming. If the early story of Homo sapiens was written in bone and fire, this next chapter was written by the wind, the sea, and the merciless swing of planetary chaos. Somewhere between 200,000 and 150,000 years ago, the African continent, the only home our species had ever known, turned into a roulette wheel of extinction. A place where the climate itself seemed to rise up against us, not just once, not twice, but over and over, as if the planet itself was testing whether this fragile experiment called humanity deserved to survive. Because when you zoom out, when you look at the climate record, not just the fossils, not just the stone tools, but the deep data buried in ocean sediments, ice cores, and lake beds, you see it. A pattern of chaos so violent it is almost difficult to comprehend from the comfort of the Holocene world we live in now. The Earth was in the grip of the Pleistocene epoch, a planetary ice age not like a single winter but like a pulse of deep freezes and unstable warming periods stretching back more than 2 million years. Massive glaciers expanding and retreating across the northern continents, yanking sea levels up and down by as much as 130 meters. And while the glaciers themselves never reached Africa, their impact absolutely did. Shifting rainfall patterns, collapsing monsoons, entire regions flipping from lush to desert and back again within just a few thousand years, sometimes within mere centuries. Look at the data from Lake Malawi in East Africa. Sediment cores pulled from its depths reveal that between 135,000 and 70,000 years ago, the lake nearly dried up, completely, not once but multiple times. A freshwater sea larger than the country of Lebanon shrinking to a puddle. The reason? A series of supercharged mega-droughts driven by the weakening or total collapse of the African monsoon. These were not bad seasons. These were not dry decades. These were apocalyptic centuries. Across much of East and Southern Africa, the landscape transformed into near uninhabitable desert. Rivers stopped flowing, forests collapsed, game animals vanished, and the humans, those few, thin bands of early Homo sapiens, had two choices: move or die. This was not a one-off disaster. Climate records show that over this 50,000-year span, the entire continent went through repeated cycles of hyper-arid drought followed by brief, unpredictable periods of wetter stability. Each swing of the pendulum would have shattered fragile ecosystems, forced migrations, fragmented populations, and erased entire networks of knowledge. Archaeological evidence backs it up. When you map the Middle Stone Age sites across Africa during this period, something chilling becomes clear. They flicker in and out of existence. Sites vanish from some regions for tens of thousands of years. Then suddenly, new sites appear, but hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away. It is not because people suddenly forgot how to make tools. It is because the places they once lived became unlivable. One brutal example is the collapse of the Sahara. Today it is the world's largest hot desert, but during certain periods of the Pleistocene, it was a green corridor. Grasslands, lakes, rivers teeming with animals and plants. Then, just as quickly, it reverted back to sand and death. If you were a hunter-gatherer living on its edge, you could wake up one decade to find your home slowly turning to dust, your prey animals disappearing, your plants withering, and with that, your entire cultural world would collapse. Imagine the psychological reality of this. For modern humans today, even a single year of drought is catastrophic. Now imagine 100 years. Imagine your grandchildren born into a world where it has not rained their entire lives. Imagine watching the lake shrink month by month, the fish die off, the trees go skeletal, the animals migrate and never return. And with every environmental collapse comes a social collapse. Groups fracture, alliances break. The transmission of knowledge falters. Oral histories die when the elders who carry them perish in a famine. The stories of the land vanish when the land itself becomes unrecognizable. This is not speculation. Genetic evidence confirms it. Modern humans carry the scars of this period in our very DNA. Studies of mitochondrial and Y chromosome lineages suggest that at least one major genetic bottleneck occurred during this window, perhaps reducing the entire Homo sapiens population to fewer than 10,000 breeding individuals. Some estimates drop as low as 2,000. That is not a thriving species. That is the edge of oblivion. Less than the population of a small town. Fewer people than fit into a single modern sports arena. It is not an exaggeration to say that humanity nearly did not make it, and yet, somehow, we did. Look at the evidence from coastal refuges like Pinnacle Point in South Africa. While the interior of the continent dried into dust, narrow strips of coastline became lifeboats. Here, humans began to rely heavily on shellfish, tidal pools, seaweed, and the consistent productivity of the ocean. This is more than a diet change. It is an adaptive revolution. Marine resources require different tools, different knowledge, different ways of reading the world. A tide chart becomes as vital as a hunting track. Knowledge of moon cycles, wave patterns, storm systems, all become part of the cognitive map. And crucially, marine environments are more resilient to drought. When the land burns and withers, the ocean remains. This may have been one of the first great turning points in the human story, a shift from purely terrestrial hunter-gathering to multi-ecosystem exploitation, and with it, the seeds of more complex culture. But even here, the archaeological record tells a story of fragility. These coastal refuges were tiny, narrow bands between ocean and desert. If the sea level rose, the land squeezed tighter. If the drought worsened, the inland routes vanished. The margin for error was razor thin. It is in this crucible of climate chaos that the modern human genome was forged. A world where every generation had to learn not just how to survive, but how to survive change itself. Where the single most valuable skill was adaptability. Where the definition of home was something that could evaporate within a lifetime. And perhaps this is the deeper answer to the mystery of the missing mind. Maybe culture, real, durable, symbolic culture, requires not just intelligence but stability, time, networks, predictability. In a world where every river can vanish, every forest can become a graveyard, and every mountain pass can turn into a dead end, maybe the luxury of storytelling simply never had room to breathe. Or maybe It was the opposite. Maybe it was here, in this planetary roulette of collapse and recovery, that the first real sparks of symbolic thought began to flicker. Because when everything you know can vanish, memory becomes a survival tool. When the land no longer tells you where to find water, a story might. When the animals are gone, a song about where they once were becomes more than entertainment. It becomes a map, a mnemonic, a lifeline. This is not just romantic speculation. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer cultures often note that their cosmologies are not just spiritual, they are encyclopedic. The Sand People's songlines encode precise information about waterholes, migration routes, and seasonal patterns. Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime stories map entire landscapes in narrative form. In a stable world, this is art. In an unstable world, it is survival. And so perhaps, beneath the surface of the archaeological silence, a different kind of memory was already forming, not etched in bone or painted on cave walls, but etched in minds, passed in voice, embodied in movement. Still, as the droughts dragged on, as the ice expanded in the north and the monsoons collapsed in the south, Homo sapiens clung to existence by the barest threads, every generation a gamble, every migration a coin flip. But the chaos machine was not done yet, because the greatest bottleneck was still to come, a catastrophe so severe it would darken the skies of the entire planet, a moment where humanity would face the closest thing to extinction it had ever known. And when we come back, we will step into that catastrophe. The Toba eruption, the volcanic winter, the moment the world almost lost us forever. If the African mega-droughts of 130,000 years ago were brutal, if the pulse of ice and desert through the Pleistocene was a chaos machine, then what came next was something different, something worse, a planetary catastrophe so severe that it did not just fracture ecosystems, or scatter families, or force migrations. It almost erased us, not metaphorically, not poetically, but mathematically. The human species, Homo sapiens, came closer to true extinction in this window than perhaps at any other point in its history. The culprit? A supervolcano, one mountain, one eruption, one day that cracked the sky and drowned the sun. 74,000 years ago, on the island of Sumatra, a mountain named Toba exploded. Not in the way that volcanoes like Etna or Vesuvius explode. This was not a mountain shedding its top. This was a mountain ceasing to be a mountain at all. The eruption released more than 2,800 cubic kilometers of ash and rock, an amount so incomprehensible that it is difficult to map onto the human mind. Imagine every skyscraper on Earth, ground to dust, and then multiplied by 100. The caldera left behind is still there today. It is called Lake Toba, a lake the size of Luxembourg, a lake shaped by absence, a wound in the planet that has never healed. The Toba eruption was not a regional disaster. It was a global one. Ash clouds reached the Arabian Peninsula. Sulfur aerosols spread into the stratosphere, blocking sunlight. Temperatures plummeted worldwide by as much as 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. Some models suggest even more in certain regions. This was not a winter. This was a volcanic ice age, a darkness that may have lasted for years. Crop failure was not a concern because agriculture did not exist yet, but the ecosystems that hunter-gatherers depended on, plants, grazing animals, fisheries, collapsed. The genetic evidence paints a brutal picture. When scientists began comparing mitochondrial DNA from modern human populations in the late 20th century, they noticed something strange, an unusually low level of genetic diversity, as if, sometime in the past, the human family tree had been squeezed through a narrow funnel, a bottleneck. Some models estimate that during this period, the global Homo sapiens population may have crashed to fewer than 3,000 individuals, possibly as low as a few hundred breeding pairs, a number smaller than the population of a single modern high school, a number where a single bad winter, a single failed hunt, a single pathogen, could have wiped us off the map completely. It is almost uncomfortable to think about how fragile the whole experiment of consciousness was, how close the universe came to never producing Bach or fire or radio telescopes, to never producing this conversation we are having right now. But the Toba bottleneck is not just a genetic ghost. It is written in the dirt. Look at the archaeological record in South Asia. Layers of toba ash blanket entire sites. In India, at Jwalapuram, the volcanic layer is clearly visible, a gray-white stripe in the earth like a scar. Beneath it, stone tools. Above it, more stone tools, but fewer, more scattered. A record that thins out, as if the very hands that made them were thinning too. But here is the twist. The stone tools beneath the ash and the tools above the ash, they are nearly identical. They show no sign of technological regression, no sign that the survivors lost their skills. This is crucial. It suggests that the cognitive capabilities of Homo sapiens were fully intact, even under the weight of planetary disaster. We did not forget how to be human. We simply became fewer. The question that haunted anthropologists for decades was whether the Toba eruption directly caused the genetic bottleneck, or whether it was just one chapter in a longer story of population instability driven by the relentless roulette of Pleistocene climate chaos. Because some geneticists argue that the bottleneck began earlier, during the mega-droughts between 135,000 and 70,000 years ago. Others propose that Toba was the nail in the coffin of an already fragile species balance. Either way, the result was the same. Humanity became a diaspora of remnants, isolated bands hugging coastlines, clinging to mountain refuges, retreating into caves, following shrinking herds through desiccated grasslands. Every family line that survives today traces back to those survivors. Every language spoken today, every song, every face, every act of love, of war, of curiosity, a single thread that refused to snap. And yet, here is the more haunting revelation. The bottleneck may not have been a singular event. It may be the natural state of Homo sapiens during this period. The climate swings were so violent, the ecological niches so precarious, that population crashes and rebounds may have been normal, not an exception, but the rule. Genomic data supports this. Studies of ancient DNA, combined with complex simulations of gene flow, suggest that Homo sapiens was never one single, massive, pan-African population. Instead, it was a constellation of small, semi-isolated groups, sometimes connected by migration corridors, sometimes cut off for thousands of years. This is why the fossils of this era show so much variation. Skulls from Herto in Ethiopia look different from those at Omo Kibish. The faces at Jebel Irhoud in Morocco are not identical to the remains at Florisbad in South Africa. We were a species, but only just. This fragmented existence has profound implications for how we think about the human story. It means that the idea of a single birthplace, a single spark of modernity, may be an illusion. Instead, it was a braided river of survival. Different groups experimenting with different tools, different strategies, different ways of being human. Some of those experiments ended in dead ends. Others became the branches of the tree that lead to us. And yet, for all that fragmentation, something else begins to stir in this window. Because the post-Toba world does not just show a species licking its wounds. It shows a species adapting, innovating. The first clear signs of long-distance trade networks appear. The movement of obsidian, shell, ochre, and tool materials across landscapes hundreds of kilometers wide. This is not simple scavenging. This is social networking, relationship building, information exchange. The bones of the symbolic world are starting to assemble. Some anthropologists propose that the very act of surviving Toba, or more broadly surviving the bottlenecks of this period, may have forced the kind of social innovations that become the foundation for later symbolic culture. When the world shrinks to a handful of survivors, every relationship matters. Alliances become the difference between extinction and endurance. The idea of us versus them sharpens. Rituals to reinforce group identity become not just spiritual practices, but survival strategies. Because here is the brutal math. A spear kills a gazelle. A fire cooks the meat. But only trust, only cooperation, only shared identity lets you survive a decade where the herds are gone, the rivers are dry, and the sky is ash. This is the moment where memory itself becomes an evolutionary advantage, where remembering who helped you, who betrayed you, who carries the knowledge of where water still flows, becomes as important as remembering how to nap a blade. And maybe, just maybe, This is where the first real sparks of myth begin to flicker. Not as art, not yet, not as cave paintings or figurines, but as rules, as codes, as songs that say, stay together, remember this place, trust this family, beware that clan, a symbolic layer grafted onto the practical machinery of survival. Still, it is not yet the explosion, not yet the full flowering of the symbolic mind that will erupt tens of thousands of years later in the caves of Europe, the shell beads of Africa, the carved figurines of Siberia. The spark has not yet caught fire, but the kindling is there, stacked, dry, waiting. Because the survivors of Toba, or perhaps the survivors of a million years of climate roulette, did not just rebuild, they reimagined. Slowly, painfully, across generations, the fragile threads of knowledge, memory, and meaning began to weave together. And something started to shift. Because coming next is a moment that no climate model, no gene sequence, no fossil had predicted. A moment when the mind itself catches fire. When, for reasons still debated, humanity stops merely surviving and starts imagining, starts dreaming, starts turning the invisible into something that leaves marks in the world. Marks we can still see today, on cave walls, on beads, on bones. But the question is, what finally tipped it? What broke the spell of the time hole? What lit the fire around 50,000 years ago? There is a moment in the archaeological record that feels like a whisper from another mind, a faint signal across the gulf of deep time. It is not a tool, it is not a weapon, it is not a practical object of any kind. It is a pattern, scratched onto a piece of ochre. Cross-hatched lines, intentional, deliberate, abstract. And it is at least 75,000 years old. Found deep inside a cave on the southern tip of Africa, a place called Blombos, a place where, for the first time, we can look at an object left by Homo sapiens and know, without question, that it meant something. That it was not for hunting, not for cutting, not for survival in the narrow material sense. It was a symbol. But a symbol of what? A map? A mark of identity? A prayer? A memory? We will never know. But this is the first trace of meaning that survives, the first fingerprint of the symbolic mind. To step back, we are now in a window between 150,000 and 130,000 years ago. The climate has begun to recover from the worst of the mega-droughts. Coastal ecosystems along the southern shores of Africa flourish in ways that the interior cannot. Humans retreat to the edges of the continent, hugging the boundary between land and sea. And here, along cliffs, caves, and tidal zones, a different kind of survival begins. One built not just on hunting and gathering, but on memory, on knowing the tides, on reading the moon, on tracking the subtle rhythms of a coastline that feeds even when the land burns. At Pinnacle Point, not far from Blombos, excavations have revealed something extraordinary. Layers of burned stone suggest the earliest known controlled use of fire to heat-treat materials, specifically silcrete, a form of stone that becomes sharper and easier to flake when heated. This is not accident, this is chemistry. This is the beginning of humans modifying raw materials at a molecular level, a quiet precursor to pottery, to metallurgy, to every act of technological transformation that would follow in the next 100 millennia. And yet even here, the most haunting finds are not the tools, but the pigments. Pieces of red ochre, iron-rich, blood-colored earth, scraped, ground, and rubbed. Some with clear wear marks suggesting it was mixed with liquid. Painted onto bodies, onto objects, onto walls. The surfaces are gone, but the pigments remain. At Blombos, the ochre goes one step further. Several pieces are engraved with abstract designs, parallel lines, cross-hatching, rhythms of line that suggest intention. Some anthropologists argue that these may be the earliest forms of notation, not writing, not yet, but perhaps tallies, or ownership marks, or clan symbols, or something deeper, an abstract representation of ideas we can no longer decode. Alongside the ochre, there are beads, tiny shells, Nacerius kraussianus, each painstakingly drilled with a hole. strung together into necklaces, bracelets, or sewn onto clothing. This is not just ornament, this is signaling, a way of saying, I am part of this group, I carry this identity, I am not like the others. Think about what it means to make a bead. You are spending hours drilling, smoothing, threading on something that has no direct survival value. You cannot hunt with it, you cannot eat it. Its value is entirely symbolic. This is a threshold moment, the point where meaning becomes portable, where identity can be worn, where memory becomes a physical object. And yet, this revolution is strangely fragile, because when you map these behaviors across time and space, something unsettling appears. They do not spread. They do not persist. The ochre markings at Blombos are real. The beads are real, but they appear, flourish for a time, and then vanish. The next layers in the cave show no beads, no engravings. The signal goes dark. This is the paradox of early Homo sapiens. The brain was ready. The hands were ready. The imagination flickered to life. But the flame did not catch. Not yet. For reasons we still do not fully understand, the symbolic mind, once born, remained an intermittent visitor, appearing in flashes, disappearing just as easily. There is a moment in the archaeological record that feels like a whisper from another mind, a faint signal across the gulf of deep time. It is not a tool, it is not a weapon, it is not a practical object of any kind. It is a pattern, scratched onto a piece of ochre, cross-hatched lines, intentional, deliberate, abstract, and it is at least 75,000 years old, found deep inside a cave on the southern tip of Africa, a place called Blombos, a place where, for the first time, we can look at an object left by Homo sapiens and know, without question, that it meant something, that it was not for hunting, not for cutting, not for survival in the narrow material sense. It was a symbol. But a symbol of what? A map? A mark of identity? A prayer? A memory? We will never know. But this is the first trace of meaning that survives, the first fingerprint of the symbolic mind. To step back, we are now in a window between 150,000 and 130,000 years ago. The climate has begun to recover from the worst of the mega-droughts. Coastal ecosystems along the southern shores of Africa flourish in ways that the interior cannot. Humans retreat to the edges of the continent, hugging the boundary between land and sea. And here, along cliffs, caves, and tidal zones, a different kind of survival begins. One built not just on hunting and gathering, but on memory, on knowing the tides, on reading the moon, on tracking the subtle rhythms of a coastline that feeds even when the land burns. At Pinnacle Point, not far from Blombos, excavations have revealed something extraordinary. Layers of burned stone suggest the earliest known controlled use of fire to heat-treat materials, specifically silcrete, a form of stone that becomes sharper and easier to flake when heated. This is not accident, this is chemistry. This is the beginning of humans modifying raw materials at a molecular level, a quiet precursor to pottery, to metallurgy, to every act of technological transformation that would follow in the next 100 millennia. And yet even here the most haunting finds are not the tools, but the pigments. Pieces of red ochre, iron-rich, blood-colored earth, scraped, ground, and rubbed. Some with clear wear marks suggesting it was mixed with liquid. Painted onto bodies? Onto objects? Onto walls? The surfaces are gone, but the pigments remain. At Blombos, the ochre goes one step further. Several pieces are engraved with abstract designs, parallel lines, cross-hatching, rhythms of line that suggest intention. Some anthropologists argue that these may be the earliest forms of notation, not writing, not yet, but perhaps tallies, or ownership marks, or clan symbols, or something deeper, an abstract representation of ideas we can no longer decode. Alongside the ochre, there are beads, tiny shells, Nacerius kraussianus, each painstakingly drilled with a hole, strung together into necklaces, bracelets, or sewn onto clothing. This is not just ornament, this is signaling, a way of saying, I am part of this group, I carry this identity, I am not like the others. Think about what it means to make a bead. You are spending hours drilling, smoothing, threading on something that has no direct survival value. You cannot hunt with it, you cannot eat it. Its value is entirely symbolic. This is a threshold moment, the point where meaning becomes portable, where identity can be worn, where memory becomes a physical object. And yet, this revolution is strangely fragile, because when you map these behaviors across time and space, something unsettling appears. They do not spread. They do not persist. The ochre markings at Blombos are real. The beads are real, but they appear, flourish for a time, and then vanish. The next layers in the cave show no beads, no engravings. The signal goes dark. This is the paradox of early Homo sapiens. The brain was ready. The hands were ready. The imagination flickered to life. But the flame did not catch. Not yet. For reasons we still do not fully understand, the symbolic mind, once born, remained an intermittent visitor, appearing in flashes, disappearing just as easily. Along the southern shores of Africa, between 150,000 and 130,000 years ago, the human story takes a strange and quietly profound turn. This is not the era of cave paintings. Not yet. Not the era of figurines or mythic epics or the explosion of meaning that would one day sweep across the world. But it is something else. Something quieter. Something harder to see in the dirt, but no less important. This is the age when memory begins to change the game. It starts with the ocean. Specifically, with the discovery that the ocean itself can be a machine for survival if you learn how to read it. At Pinnacle Point and nearby coastal sites, the archaeological record tells a story that is both practical and psychological. It is the story of humans learning the tides, of humans learning the moon. Because this coastline offers a gift, but only to those who pay attention. At low tide, the rocky shelves are exposed, revealing mussels, limpets, and shellfish. A protein-rich buffet. But at high tide, the sea reclaims it. Without timing, without memory, the resource disappears. This is not a trivial skill. Knowing the rhythms of the sea requires the ability to map time, to link patterns in the sky, the phases of the moon, to the patterns of water. This is not instinct. This is knowledge. And knowledge, here, becomes survival. The middens, massive piles of shell, left behind by these early coastal foragers, tell the story in layers, generation after generation harvesting the same shelves, learning which species to take and which to leave to allow the population to recover. This is sustainable exploitation. This is resource management. This is, in a quiet way, a kind of proto-science, an early experiment in the idea that the world follows rules, rules that can be learned, remembered, taught. But the coastline is not just a pantry, it is a laboratory. It is here that humans begin experimenting with fire in ways no previous hominin ever had. At Pinnacle Point, archaeologists uncovered clear evidence that people were not just using fire for warmth or protection. They were using it to transform stone, specifically to heat-treat silkrete, a local stone that becomes brittle and glassy when exposed to high, sustained heat. When this process is done correctly, silkrete fractures more predictably. It flakes into sharper, more effective tools. This is not intuitive. You cannot stumble across this by accident. The process requires sustained fire at high temperatures for hours, which means controlled fire pits, understanding of airflow, fuel management, and timing. It is the first known example of humans altering the molecular structure of materials, a quiet foreshadowing of metallurgy tens of thousands of years in the future. But it also means something else. It means someone figured it out, and someone else remembered it, and someone else taught it. This is the rise of procedural memory, not just knowing how to do something, but knowing how to teach someone else to do it. And yet, when you scan the archaeological layers of this era, the pattern remains frustrating. There are the hints of symbolic behavior. There are the signs of advanced technological cognition. But it flickers. It does not spread far. It does not explode into the full flood of cultural complexity that comes later. At Blombos, the ochre engravings appear. At Klasis River, shell middens stretch for meters. At Sibudu Cave, evidence of bedding, grass mats laced with aromatic herbs to repel insects, suggests a sophisticated understanding of comfort and health. This is not simple survival. This is homemaking. And yet, the story does not catch fire. These sites are like isolated lighthouses in the dark ocean of time, each one brilliant, each one fleeting. Why? Some researchers argue that the limiting factor was population size. Even as coastal living stabilized food supplies, the numbers were still small. A few hundred, maybe a few thousand scattered along the coastline. In populations this small, cultural complexity is fragile. Lose a key elder, lose a master toolmaker, lose the one person who remembers how to navigate by the stars, and the knowledge can vanish in a single generation. Others point to climate. This period, known as marine isotope stage 6, was a brief interglacial window sandwiched between brutal pulses of ice and drought. For a few thousand years, conditions improved. Grasslands spread, rivers flowed, coastal ecosystems flourished. But the pattern was temporary. As the world shifted back toward aridity, the lifelines snapped. Populations contracted again. Networks collapsed. But there is a third theory, a quieter one that suggests that what we are seeing here is not failure, it is rehearsal. Because when you look closely at the technologies and behaviors of this era, a pattern emerges. Not one of constant progress, but one of iteration, trial, error, adaptation. The same core technologies, microlithic tools, fire-hardened blades, ochre use, appear, vanish, reappear. They are passed on, but unevenly, sometimes locally, sometimes for hundreds of kilometers, but never fully global, not yet. This is not because the brain was incapable. By this point, Homo sapiens had the same cranial capacity as modern humans. The hardware was ready. What was still fragile was the software, the operating system of culture, of transmission, of shared memory. Think about what it means to live in a world where everything you know exists only inside someone else's head. There are no books, no drawings, no written language, no archives. If the shellfish gatherer dies, the knowledge of the tides dies with her. If the firekeeper who knows how to heat-treat silkcrete catches a fever, the technology collapses back into the dirt. This is the bottleneck of oral culture, a problem every Homo sapiens group faced for nearly all of history until very recently. And it is a problem that does not solve itself until populations become dense enough, interconnected enough, and stable enough that memory begins to outlive the individual. And yet, even within this fragility, something astonishing happens. These coastal foragers did not just survive, they began to develop something else, a relationship with the land that was mental, not just physical. The shell middens were not just trash piles, they were archives, records of abundance, of return. The more you returned to the same spot, the more the pile grew. A visible reminder that your grandparents were here, that their parents were here, that this place sustains life. The ochre, not just pigment, not just decoration, possibly mnemonic devices, a physical focus for memory, for story, for identity. The fire-treated silkcrete, not just sharper blades, but an extension of cognition, proof that humans could imagine not just what something is, but what it could become. And the shell beads? A wearable memory. An object that says, I belong, I remember, I am part of this. All of this is the architecture of memory, not the full-blown symbolic explosion. Not yet, but the scaffolding that makes it possible. Still, it is not enough. When the climate shifts again, when the sea levels fall, when the food webs collapse, much of this knowledge fragments. The signal flickers. The beads disappear from the layers. The ochre stops appearing. The shell middens become thin. The fire pits go cold. This was not the explosion. Not yet. But was it a rehearsal? A failed spark? Or simply the necessary winding of the spring? Because the truth is, the spring does not snap. It holds. The memory of these things does not die. It recedes. It goes underground. It moves with the people who retreat inland, who scatter, who survive. And waiting, deep in the genetic code, deep in the memory of landscapes, deep in the whispered songs of families who have forgotten more than we will ever know, is the next chapter. The chapter where memory becomes story, and story becomes everything. Across the windswept plains of Pleistocene Europe, through the dense oak forests, the bitter ice margins, and the limestone caves that pockmark the hillsides from Gibraltar to Siberia, there lived another kind of human. For nearly 300,000 years before the so-called explosion of Homo sapiens, they were here, walking upright, crafting tools, lighting fires, burying their dead. Their bones were thick, their limbs stocky, their faces framed by heavy brows and broad noses built to warm the freezing air of the Ice Age. And yet if you stood before one, dressed them in a jacket and jeans, and met their gaze, you would know. You would know instantly. This was not an animal. This was not a failed prototype. This was a person. The Neanderthals first emerged clearly in the fossil record around 400,000 years ago, descended most likely from an earlier hominin called Homo heidelbergensis, a common ancestor shared with us. As Homo sapiens were slowly evolving in Africa, the Neanderthals were evolving in parallel across Europe and Western Asia. Their bodies grew wider, shorter, more powerfully built, a direct response to the relentless glaciations that swept and retreated like breath across the continent for hundreds of thousands of years. And yet, to imagine them simply as brute survivors is not just wrong, it is a failure of imagination. Their toolkit alone shatters that myth. Known as the Mysterian industry, Neanderthal tools were not crude hand axes hacked out of river stones. These were sophisticated, prepared core flakes, Levallois technology, designed to produce sharp, standardized blades with minimum waste. They crafted spear points, scrapers, awls, bone tools, birch tar adhesives to haft stone to wood. This was not instinct. This was recipe, procedure, knowledge passed down over and over. But it was not only their tools that speak, their dead speak too. At Shanidar Cave in the mountains of Iraq, a man was buried roughly 65,000 years ago. His skeleton tells a brutal story: a withered arm, a crushed eye socket, a limp from a childhood injury that never healed properly. And yet he lived well into adulthood, long beyond the point where his injuries would have made solo survival impossible. Someone cared for him, fed him, protected him. He was not left behind. He was not discarded. And nearby, another skeleton lies dusted with pollen. Wildflowers, perhaps. Were they placed there in ritual, or blown in by the wind? The debate continues. But the suggestion echoes. At La Pasiega in Spain, nearly 65,000 years ago, long before Homo sapiens ever set foot in Europe, Neanderthals stood deep within a cave, their torches guttering against the stone, and painted. Red ochre marks, ladder-like grids, dots, abstract, deliberate, symbolic. It is the oldest known cave art in Europe, and it was not made by us. Even more haunting are the rings of stalagmites deep in Bruniquel Cave, France, built nearly 176,000 years ago, broken off, arranged in concentric circles, constructed 200 meters inside a pitch-black cave. What was this for? Shelter? Ceremony? Signal? We do not know. But we know what it was not. It was not random. They used pigments, manganese dioxide in powdered form, possibly to aid in fire starting, or perhaps for decoration. Traces of red and black are found on tools, on bones, sometimes even on the walls of caves, and they wore ornaments. Eagle talons, scraped, pierced, and likely strung together as necklaces, were found at sites in Croatia dating back at least 130,000 years. Their diets were flexible. They hunted mammoths, woolly rhinos, horses, and bison, but they also gathered shellfish on the Iberian coast, pine nuts, tubers. They understood seasons. They planned. And when climate shifts drove animals into migrations or the glaciers advanced, the Neanderthals moved with them. And yes, they buried their dead. Not always, not everywhere, but often enough and consistently enough to suggest this was more than disposal. It was care. It was memory. It was the first steps toward ritual. For decades, the story of Neanderthals was written by their absence, by the fact that they were gone and we were not. Victorian scientists cast them as clumsy, dim-witted cave brutes, a dead end, a failed experiment in humanity. But this was projection, a mirror turned dark. Because the truth is not that they were primitive. The truth is that they were different. Their brains were as large as ours, often larger, but shaped differently. Flatter in the parietal lobes, perhaps indicating different pathways of spatial reasoning, of memory, of cognition. We do not know how they spoke, but their vocal tracts, reconstructed from the hyoid bone, suggest that they could. Maybe not with the same fluidity, the same range, the same grammar, or maybe exactly the same. The debate still rages. And their hands were capable, their thumbs broader, stronger at the base, ideal for power grips, for torque, for shaping wood and stone with precision and force. But what about myth? What about art? What about the explosion of meaning that defines the human leap around 50,000 years ago? Did they have it? The evidence says, almost. The cave markings at La Pasiega, the stalagmite rings at Bruniquel, the talon necklaces, the burial pollen at Shanidar, each one a whisper, a flicker of symbolic thought. But like the early Homo sapiens in Africa, it never quite catches fire. Not fully, not globally. Some researchers believe that Neanderthal cultures were structured differently, perhaps more local, more kin group centered, with less exchange of ideas between distant bands. Without large interconnected populations, innovations may have flickered in and out of existence, like campfires glowing on a windswept steppe, each one alone against the dark. Others point to demography. The Neanderthal world was always smaller. Genetic studies suggest that their effective population size, the number of breeding individuals, rarely rose above a few thousand. Small populations are vulnerable to famine, to disease, to bad luck. And then there is the encounter. Roughly 60,000 years ago, Homo sapiens walked out of Africa and into Neanderthal lands. And something happened, something complex, something neither simple warfare nor simple absorption can fully explain. We interbred. That much is written in our genes. Today, every person of non-African ancestry carries between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA, genes for skin, for immunity, for fat metabolism, for survival in cold. We exchanged more than genes, perhaps ideas, perhaps technologies, perhaps fears, perhaps stories. And within 10 to 15,000 years, the Neanderthals were gone. Why? Climate played a role. The ice advanced, ecosystems shifted, small populations fragmented further. But the arrival of Homo sapiens added pressure, competition for prey, for territory, maybe even for mates. But it is not a story of conquest. It is a story of drift, of fragile populations pushed past the brink, a story of the brutal arithmetic of survival. And yet, when we look into the caves of Europe, we do not just see the absence. We see the memory, their memory, the handprints on the walls, the ochre, the talons, the rings of stone in the dark. The Neanderthals did not vanish. They echo in our blood, in our bones, in the parts of our genome that whisper of winters we never knew, of landscapes we never saw, of cousins we never met. So were they holding the same spark, or a different one, a mirror, or a parallel fire? The answer, like the paintings in the caves, is unfinished. Because this was not the only other humanity. Far to the east, in the shadowed caves of Siberia, another story waits, another kind of human, one even more mysterious. And that is where we are going next. Far beyond the frozen forests of Neanderthal Europe, tucked deep in the limestone caves of the Altai Mountains in Siberia, a tiny fragment of bone was waiting to rewrite the story of human history. It was just a sliver, a pinky, barely the size of a coin. But locked inside was a secret no archaeologist had expected. When scientists sequenced its DNA in the year 2010, it didn't match Homo sapiens. It didn't match Neanderthals. It belonged to someone else. A third branch of the human family tree, the Denisovans. And just like that, the mirror shattered wider. We know their bones are few. A tooth, a finger, a jaw from a cave in Tibet. A scattering of fragments that could fit inside a single shoebox. But their legacy is vast. Their DNA lives on in modern people from Oceania, Australia, the Philippines, and parts of East and Southeast Asia. Some populations carry up to 5% Denisovan genes, genes that help with high-altitude adaptation in Tibetans. genes that shaped immune systems for life in new landscapes, genes that came from a people we still barely understand. Who were they? Like the Neanderthals, the Denisovans split from a common ancestor with Homo sapiens around 500 to 600,000 years ago. They roamed across Asia, an empire of memory without borders, without writing, without a single preserved face. Their genetic footprints show deep time migrations, into Papua, into the Philippines, into the icy Tibetan plateau, where even today their genes help humans breathe thinner air. And they were not simple. In the same Denisova cave where their bones were found, archaeologists uncovered something else, a bracelet, green chlorite, polished, drilled, tooled with precision so fine it likely required a rotary drill, a technology Homo sapiens would not reliably master for tens of thousands of years. This is not the work of animals. This is craft. This is art, a mind shaped for precision, for beauty, for meaning. But where is their explosion? Where are their painted caves, their vast symbolic cultures, their cathedrals of the mind? The answer remains buried. Maybe they had them, carved from wood and fiber, now long dissolved into the soil. Maybe they sang songs that drifted into the cold wind, never written down, never fossilized. Or maybe the spark flickered but never caught, like the Neanderthals, like so many before. But the Denisovans were not alone in their mystery. Half a world away, on a lush volcanic island in Indonesia, a different kind of human left behind bones that stunned the world. Discovered in 2003, in Liang Bua Cave on Flores, they were tiny, barely over a meter tall, with brains the size of grapefruits. But make no mistake, this was no ape. This was Homo floresiensis, the hobbit. And they were not ancient relics from the distant past. They lived until about 50,000 years ago. They were building tools, hunting pygmy elephants, surviving in isolation while the rest of the world changed. No one knows exactly how they got there. Did their ancestors sail or drift or walk across now submerged land bridges? However they arrived, they became something the world had never seen. Humans, but miniaturized by the brutal arithmetic of island evolution. And yet, the same question returns. Why didn't it happen there? They had tools, they had fire, they hunted, they planned. But there is no evidence of painting, no jewelry, no ritual burials, no explosion of myth. And then, even deeper back in time, and yet stranger still, South Africa, the Rising Star Cave System. A dark labyrinth so narrow that even experienced cavers struggled to navigate it. And inside, bones, dozens of them, a species never seen before, small-brained, short, climbing hands, curved fingers, but with a twist that defies everything paleoanthropology thought it knew. They were deliberately depositing their dead. This is Homo naledi. They lived between roughly 335,000 and 230,000 years ago, long after brains the size of theirs were supposed to have disappeared from the evolutionary story. Their cranial capacity was barely a third of ours, and yet, they treated the dead differently, carefully, repeatedly. This was not random. This was not a carnivore den or a natural trap. This was intentional. What does that mean? How does a creature with a brain smaller than a modern chimpanzee perform a behavior we long thought required symbolic reasoning, an awareness of death, of identity, of memory? Once again, the whisper, the haunting almost. Tool users, fire users, perhaps symbol users, but not symbol makers, not myth builders, not yet. So here it is, parallel after parallel, Denisovans, Neanderthals, hobbits, Homo naledi, and others lost to time, ghost species that flicker in our DNA but have left no bones behind, a tangle of cousins, a family tree that is not a tree at all, but a braided river delta of migrations, mergers, extinctions, and memory. Each one with a mind, a culture, a way of being, each one dancing around the edge of something, but never crossing, never triggering the runaway explosion of meaning that would erupt suddenly, irreversibly, in one small corner of Africa, 50,000 years ago. Why? Some say it was population, the lonely clusters of Denisovans, of Neanderthals, of island dwarfs, too small, too scattered, for ideas to build into momentum. Knowledge would flicker, then vanish when its holders died. A better tool, a better hunting strategy, a ritual, a song, gone, extinguished by isolation. Others point to environment. Harsh, unpredictable climates forced every group inward, toward survival, not imagination. When the ice marched south, when the rains vanished, when the sea swallowed coastlines, there was no space for myth. Or maybe it is random. A cosmic dice roll, a chance recombination of genes, a cultural accident, a child who told a story so compelling that it was retold, a symbol that resonated, a ritual that worked, and suddenly, the spiral began. But here is the quiet terror. If the Denisovans could almost do it, if the Neanderthals could almost do it, if the hobbits of Flores could almost do it, and if Homo naledi, tiny-brained, cave-haunting Homo naledi, could almost do it, then what does that say about us? Were we inevitable, or were we just lucky? Because the fuse was lit. The whispers of ochre, the beads of blombos, the footprints of migrants long forgotten, the ghosts of cousins whose faces we will never reconstruct. And 50,000 years ago, the fire finally caught. But why then, and only then? That is the mystery waiting on the other side of the next chapter. It was supposed to be a simple story, a single origin, a clean line, one population of early Homo sapiens, born somewhere in Africa around 300,000 years ago, slowly expanding outward, replacing every other human species in its path. That was the model. That was the story written in textbooks, whispered in documentaries, and repeated in museums for decades. A ladder, a march, a beginning with a straight road to now. And it is wrong. In the year 2023, a paper appeared in Nature. Not a splashy headline, not some speculative TED Talk theory, but a sober reconstruction of the deepest riddle in human origins. A tangled riddle made not from bones, but from DNA. A quiet, devastating correction to the story of us. It is called the weakly structured stem model, and it changes everything. Because what the genome reveals is this: Homo sapiens is not the child of one population. We are the child of two ancient human groups, two lineages that diverged not thousands but over 1.5 million years ago, older than Neanderthals, older than Denisovans, a split so deep it rewrites the boundaries of what even counts as a species. And then, around 300,000 years ago, they merged. Not fully, not in a single event, but in waves, across millennia, across landscapes. They reconnected, they remixed, and the result was us. This is not the story of a tree. It is not the story of a clean branching evolution, where each split leads to extinction or replacement. It is a braided river, a tangle of streams, separating, winding, then rejoining again and again across deep time. The clues were always there. Look at the fossil record. Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, Homo kibish in Ethiopia, Florisbod in South Africa, skulls that look like us in the face but archaic in the brain case, others with modern brains but strange faces, a scatter of features that never seem to line up. Why would one population in North Africa look so different from one in the South? Why did traits not evolve together? Because they weren't the same population. They were branches of the same species, living apart for over 1 million years, then blending back together. The DNA confirms it. The genetic divergence between the two source populations is so ancient that it matches the kind of split you would expect between separate species, if they had stayed apart. But they didn't. They maintained a weak, slow trickle of gene flow over those 1 million years, not enough to erase their differences, but enough that when climate, geography, or luck brought them back together, they were still genetically compatible. This is not hybridization in the shallow sense. It's not a modern sapiens mating with a Neanderthal and producing a few hybrids. This is deeper. This is the foundation. This is the species itself emerging out of hybrid origins. Think about what that means. Homo sapiens is not the child of a single ecological niche, not the product of a single selective pressure. We are the fusion of two ancient human survival strategies, two lifeways, two histories, one lineage adapted to one corner of Africa, one to another. Perhaps one was coastal, the other inland. Perhaps one was specialized for forests, the other for savanna. Perhaps one was hunter-heavy, another more reliant on gathering, trapping, or fishing. Their bodies, their brains, their cultures, their adaptations diverged for over 1 million years. And then, the ice shifted. The rain belts moved, deserts grew, rivers dried, coastlines shifted, and the walls that separated them fell. They met, they merged, and in the wake of that reunion, the modern human form stabilized. Suddenly, the odd scatter of fossils starts to make sense. The long face of Jebel Irhoud, the globular brain case of Homo kibish, the strange jaw of Florisbad. They are not failures in the fossil record. They are snapshots of a remixing process, evolution in progress, the assembly of a species from pieces. But it gets stranger. Because this model also explains why, for so long, the cognitive explosion didn't happen. You can have the body of a modern human without the mind of one, or more precisely, without the culture of one. The toolkits of this period, the Middle Stone Age, are advanced. Stone points, hafted spears, fire-treated blades. But they are static. They last for tens of thousands of years with little change. No cave art, no burial goods, no symbolic explosion. Why? Because small populations don't scale culture. When these groups were separated, knowledge hit a ceiling. Innovations could arise, but then disappear with their inventors. One small tribe might figure out how to create fishing traps, or how to cure hides better, or how to encode myth in carving. But if that tribe collapsed from drought, disease, or war, the knowledge vanished with them. Culture resets to zero. The weakly structured stem wasn't just a biological fact, it was a cultural trap. Fragmented populations can't pass memory forward reliably. Ideas flicker, songs fade, symbols never stabilize. Only when enough people cluster, long enough, densely enough, can culture snowball. This is what comes later, around 60 to 50,000 years ago, when the last of the old barriers broke, when populations exploded along coasts, rivers, and fertile corridors, when trade, marriage, and migration finally stitched together the scattered human web into something resilient. That was the moment the archaeological record catches fire. Cave paintings, beads, burials, sculpture, music, myth. But for the hundreds of thousands of years before that, the stem was tangled. The pieces were there, the mind was ready, the body was ready, but the fire never caught. And there is one more unsettling truth buried in this model. It means that the boundaries between species are illusions. Neanderthals were not separate in any hard biological sense. Denisovans were not separate. Even Homo naledi, small-brained as they were, might sit closer to us than we think. The fossil record draws lines that DNA refuses to honor. Speciation in the human story is not clean. It is not the ladder you were taught. It is a slow, chaotic braid. Populations separate, adapt, change, then collide again, merge, hybridize, erase the boundaries, and the cycle repeats. It means we were never destined. We were never the chosen species. We are the product of accidents, of climate shifts, of wandering migrations, of hybrid encounters that could easily have gone differently. Change one drought pattern, shift one river, tilt one coastline, and the entire story changes. In another timeline, the Jebel Irhoud lineage never reconnects, or the southern lineage collapses before the merger, or a disease wipes out one branch before they can meet. In those worlds, Homo sapiens never forms, or forms differently, or doesn't survive long enough to leave Africa at all. And yet, somehow, the tangled stem held. The remix worked. The fragile braid of memory, flesh, and adaptation pulled itself forward. But the clock was still ticking. The chaos machine of climate hadn't finished with us yet. Another catastrophe was coming. A supervolcano, an extinction-level bottleneck, one final narrowing of the funnel through which every living human would have to pass. And on the other side of that, the spark would finally catch. But why? Only then. That is where we are going next. It is one of the strangest facts about being human. You are not just human. You are a hybrid, a remix, a mosaic stitched together from ghosts. Right now, inside every person of European, Asian, or indigenous American descent, between 1 to 4% of your DNA comes from Neanderthals. If your ancestors trace to Oceania, you probably carry an additional 4 to 6% from Denisovans, an archaic cousin so mysterious that for most of human history, we did not even know they existed. Their entire discovery was not made from a skeleton, or even a skull, but from a fragment of pinky bone and a single molar pulled out of the Denisova cave in Siberia in the year 2010. That was it. A scrap of bone, a molar, and a genetic signal that rewrote everything. Because that signal was inside us. Still, thousands of generations later. These are not evolutionary footnotes. This is the blood memory of encounters that happened between roughly 60,000 and 40,000 years ago, and possibly even earlier. Encounters that were not one-offs, not rare. They were frequent enough, persistent enough, that their genetic fingerprints persist in almost every human alive today, outside of sub-Saharan Africa. But here is the mystery. If Homo sapiens were fully modern before these encounters, if our brains were already as large, as capable, as creative as ours are today, why did we absorb so much from them? Why do we carry their blood? Why do we carry their genes? What did they give us? And the darker question, what did they take? Because it was not just about sex. It was not just about chance. It was about survival. The genes we inherited are not random. Many of them are functional. They shaped our immune systems. They altered how we respond to viruses, bacteria, even how our skin reacts to sunlight in northern climates. Some genes affected our blood oxygen levels, particularly the Denisovan adaptations that allow modern Tibetans to thrive at high altitudes. Others affect fat storage, metabolic rates, brain development, and even depression, nicotine addiction, and circadian rhythms. These are not trivial. They are relics of ancient survival strategies blended into us because the environments we entered demanded them. But was that all? Did we just take their immune systems, their climate hacks, and move on? Or was there something else in the exchange? Something deeper? This is where the theories get strange. Some researchers argue that interbreeding was not just an accident of migration, it was the final ingredient. That the spark of culture, the explosion we see around 50,000 years ago, may have depended in part on the hybrid vigor of mixing. Because here is the problem. Before these encounters, Homo sapiens had the body, the brain, the tools. We were hunting, we were making blades, we were using fire, and yet the mind, the symbolic, myth-making, meaning-soaked mind, was quiet. The archaeological record is eerie in its silence. No cave paintings, no bone flutes, no ritual burials with grave goods. The symbols are absent. Then the mixing happens. And within a few thousand years, a blink in evolutionary terms, the world changes. Suddenly, humans are leaving Africa in waves. Suddenly, there are bead necklaces, cave art, figurines, ceremonial burials. There is music. There are stories. Memory moves out of the body, out of neurons, and into the world, etched in ochre, carved in ivory, painted on limestone. Is it a coincidence? Some argue yes. They say population size explains it. That once enough humans clustered in resource-rich areas, like coastal South Africa or the Levant, the density alone allowed culture to scale. Ideas stopped dying with their inventors. Language got more complex. Myths stabilized. Memory became external. But others suggest the hybrids mattered, that the infusion of genes from Neanderthals, from Denisovans, and possibly from other archaic humans we have not even identified yet, the so-called ghost populations, tweaked the sapiens' brain in just the right ways. There are tantalizing clues. Some of the Neanderthal-derived genes affect neural development. Some Denisovan fragments influence how synapses form. One theory proposes that certain Neanderthal genes affected dopamine regulation, which may have altered patterns of reward, motivation, and creativity. Others suggest that interbreeding introduced variations in circadian rhythms, which could have changed sleep patterns, vigilance cycles, and maybe even the tendency toward altered states of consciousness, the kind linked to trance, music, and the earliest forms of spiritual experience. Did the spark require the right mixture? We do not know. Not yet. But there is something undeniable in the pattern. Homo sapiens were cognitively capable long before the cultural explosion. The pieces were there, and yet the match would not light, not through droughts, not through ice ages, not through the technological advances of the Middle Stone Age. Then, within a window between roughly 55,000 and 45,000 years ago, it happens. The ghosts in our blood are not silent witnesses. They are participants. They were the neighbors, the rivals, the partners, the occasional enemies, the occasional spouses, and perhaps they were the mirrors we needed. Because here is the haunting symmetry. When Homo sapiens moved into Europe, within less than 10,000 years, the Neanderthals vanished. When sapiens reached the Denisovan ranges of Siberia, the Denisovans disappear. The timeline is brutally consistent. Every time sapiens arrives, the others go extinct. And yet, they are not gone. They are inside us. It is a paradox. The very beings whose disappearance made us the last humans also made us who we are. But it is not the only paradox. Because even with all this, even with the hybrid vigor, the genetic gifts, the borrowed immunity, the borrowed synapses, the cognitive explosion does not happen right away. Not in every population, not in every place. The first beads, the first ochre carvings, the first buried bones, they are sparse, local, fragile. And so the question still looms. Even with the genes, why did it not ignite fully until 50,000 years ago? What were they waiting for? That is where we are going next. If you could rewind the planet, not just the last century, not just the last few thousand years, but the last 100,000, you would see something extraordinary. The shorelines collapse outward. Entire continents get bigger. Islands become peninsulas. Land bridges rise where today there is only ocean. The Persian Gulf turns into a vast, lush basin. The English Channel disappears, replaced by rivers and valleys. The Sunda Shelf connects Southeast Asia into a single supercontinent, and stretching around every coastline of Africa, Asia, Australia, and the Americas is a ribbon of land, hundreds of kilometers wide, now drowned under the ocean. This was prime real estate for ancient humans, because coastlines are where the food is: fish, shellfish, seabirds, rivers feeding into the ocean, fresh water meeting salt, shelters in cliffs, flat ground for camps, predictable tides, warm breezes, open horizons, for mobile hunter-gatherers. And for the earliest experimenters with settlement, the coast was a paradise. And yet, it is gone. When the last ice age locked up water in glaciers, sea levels were as much as 120 meters lower than today. 120 meters. Imagine that. The entire continental shelf exposed. Across the world, an estimated 20 million square kilometers of land, roughly the size of North America, vanished beneath the waves when the ice melted. This is not just geography. This is the missing stage, the drowned library of human origins. Because every time we look back at the prehistoric record and say, why aren't there more settlements? Why aren't there more clues? Why does the record feel broken, incomplete? We are forgetting to ask the obvious question. What if the answers are underwater? It is not a fringe theory. It is a mathematical certainty. Every single coastline on Earth has shifted since the peak of the Ice Age, and coastlines are where humans concentrated. This is not speculation. It is what we see again and again from every archaeological site that survives near a modern shoreline. Humans hug the coasts. They always have. But during the window from roughly 130,000 to about 10,000 years ago, the entire late Pleistocene, sea levels fluctuated dramatically, and the most stable, hospitable, food-rich landscapes would not have been where the modern shoreline is. They would have been far out on what is now the ocean floor. There is evidence, tiny fragments of it, that this was true. Off the coast of Australia, The submerged shelf shows traces of ancient fire pits. Off the British Isles, the drowned landscape of Doggerland preserves stone tools, bones, even traces of human settlement, now buried beneath sediment. Along the Sunda Shelf between modern Indonesia and Malaysia, sonar surveys reveal river channels, lake beds, and raised areas that would have been perfect for early camps. The same is true in the Persian Gulf, the Adriatic Sea, and the Bering Land Bridge. But here is the problem. Underwater archaeology is hard. The sea does not preserve bones and wood like dry caves do. Saltwater corrodes, currents bury, sediments shift, and the technology required to scan, map, and excavate the ocean floor has only existed for a few decades, mostly developed for military and oil exploration, not for archaeology. So when we say there is no evidence of settlements older than, say, 50,000 years, what we really mean is there is no evidence where we happen to be looking. On dry land, on the fragment that was not swallowed. And it raises the haunting question. What if entire chapters of the human story are missing because we have been digging in the wrong place? Think about the story we have built so far. Homo sapiens emerging in Africa between 300,000 and 200,000 years ago. Technologically advanced, with blades, fire, adhesives, composite tools, but culturally quiet. No massive symbolic explosion, no cave art, no monumental constructions, just the slow hum of survival. Then, somewhere between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago, it happens. The curve bends. Symbolic culture explodes. Humans cross to Australia, cross to Europe, cross into new ecosystems that were previously unreachable. But what if there is an entire rehearsal we cannot see? A phase of coastal experimentation, building, gathering, storytelling that left no trace because the ocean swallowed it? The argument is not just romantic, it is mathematical. There are patterns in human behavior that simply do not make sense otherwise. Why, for instance, do the earliest confirmed human settlements, like those in the Levant, South Africa, and the coasts of Australia, appear so rapidly adapted to coastal life? Spearfishing, deep-sea shell collection, tidal foraging. These are not the skills of wandering savanna hunters. These are the skills of people who have spent generations, thousands of years, mastering the ocean edge. And there is the technology puzzle, the Middle Stone Age toolkit, with its microliths, hafted spears, bone tools, appears fully formed in the archaeological record, as if developed elsewhere and only migrating inland. Where is the workshop where it was invented? How many of those workshops are now drowned? Then there is the migration riddle, the journey to Australia. Even during the lowest sea levels, crossing from Southeast Asia to Australia required open sea travel, journeys of at least 70 to 100 kilometers with no land in sight. This is not accidental driftwood survival. This is navigation, planning, boat building. And yet, where are the boats? Where are the shipyards? They are gone, underwater. The same riddle appears with Japan, with the Philippines, with islands off the Mediterranean. Again and again, human dispersal requires marine competence, long before we have terrestrial archaeological proof of the same cognitive leap. Even the origins of farming may be implicated. Some researchers argue that the earliest experiments with plant cultivation may not have happened in the river valleys we traditionally emphasize, like the Nile, the Tigris, or the Yangtze, but on drowned coastlines where humans gathered wild grains, shellfish, and tubers in abundance. When the sea rose, those early proto-farms disappeared, and the surviving populations brought the knowledge inland, seeding the Neolithic revolutions we eventually recorded. And it is not just prehistory. Even during the Holocene, the last 10,000 years, we see the same pattern. Sites flood, histories vanish. The Black Sea flood around 7,000 years ago may have drowned entire settlements. Rising seas in Southeast Asia erased massive areas of human habitation. In the Americas, indigenous coastal societies left almost no trace after post-glacial sea level rise submerged the Pacific and Atlantic coasts. In other words, the archaeological record is not just incomplete, it is biased, heavily, skewed toward upland, inland sites that were not prime real estate for the people actually living through prehistory. The land where the real action happened is gone. So when we look at that haunting pause in the human story, that long, strange gap where Homo sapiens had the brain, the tools, the fire, but not the myth, not the memory, not the explosion, maybe we are asking the wrong question. Maybe it did happen. Maybe the fire was lit. Maybe there were cultures, not just bands of foragers, but dense, thriving coastal cultures, with music, with myth, with art painted on cliffs now 60 meters beneath the sea. Maybe there were carved stones that faced the sunrise over a shoreline now long gone. Maybe there were burial grounds, ceremonial sites, stories that were told for 20,000 years and then drowned, leaving only a ripple in the genetics of the survivors. And when the sea rose, when the ice melted, when the waves swallowed it all, the survivors fled inland, and the memory faded. And when the explosion finally comes, around 50,000 years ago, what we are seeing is not the beginning. It is the reboot. The archaeological record does not contradict this. It hints at it. The oldest symbolic artifacts, the beads, the engraved ochre, the polished shells, appear disproportionately along coasts, and they cluster suspiciously close to drowned shelf areas. But we do not know. Not yet. The technology to explore the ocean floor is only now catching up to the problem. LiDAR, seafloor mapping, sub-bottom profiling, robotic submersibles. As these tools expand, the great erased map of human history may slowly begin to reappear. But until then, the ocean keeps its secrets. And the question haunts: how much of the story of us is still underwater? And if it is, how would we even know? Because if the fire was lit once and drowned, then the next question is simple. Why did it light again? Only then? Only 50,000 years ago? That is where we are going next. Here's a grim little truth about archaeology, and about time itself. Almost everything disappears. Not just slowly, not eventually, but fast. Faster than most people ever realize. If Homo sapiens or any of our cousins ever built something grand, a structure of wood, a boat, a village of fiber and hide, a ceremonial circle of driftwood, or even just a library of songs passed by voice, the odds are that time ate it, completely, without a trace. Because archaeology, despite all its romantic images of tombs and ruins and ancient treasure, is really the science of leftovers. And the rules of leftovers are brutal. Stone survives, bone survives, sometimes. Fire-hardened clay might make it. Metal, depending on its type and its luck with corrosion, has a shot. But wood? Gone. Fiber? Gone. Skin, hair, fur, reed mats, woven baskets, ropes, sails, nets, furniture, drums, carved wooden idols, canoes, paddles, thatched roofs, scaffolding, beds, shoes, clothes, fences, fish traps, sleds, backpacks, and musical instruments. Gone. Not in tens of thousands of years. Often in mere decades if left exposed to air, water, and bacteria. Even worse, 99% of human expression never left a physical trace at all. Stories, myths, language, songs, memories, rituals, rules of marriage, laws, superstitions, dreams, everything that lived in voice, in gesture, in performance, everything we would now call culture, was air. Which leads to the terrifying math of the erasure engine. Imagine a world where 99% of everything is made of wood, fiber, skin, bone, smoke, and sound. A world where stone tools exist, sure, but they are not the centerpiece of daily life. They are accents. What matters are the baskets for gathering, the shelters that block the wind, the rafts that cross the bay, the nets that catch the fish, the fires that smoke the meat, the songs that hold the history, the dances that teach the law. Now imagine the passage of just a few thousand years. Rain, wind, fungus, bacteria, insects, waves, earthquakes, floods, fires, rising seas, shifting rivers. Every single wooden post falls, every fiber mat rots, every canoe collapses into silt. The bones of the people are scattered by animals, crushed by the weight of soil, or dissolved by acidic ground. Their stories, the entire mythos of that culture, evaporates the moment the last person who knew the words dies. And now, multiply that by 100,000 years. The fact that anything survives at all from deep time is a miracle of physics. It requires the most specific, most improbable conditions: a sealed cave, a desiccating desert, a deep anaerobic bog, a volcanic ash layer, a freak event of preservation. Otherwise, the world resets, the world forgets. And this is not theoretical, this is measurable. Even in historical time, the last few thousand years, most wooden ships vanish completely. Only a few survive, buried in mud or trapped in anoxic water. Viking ships, Egyptian reed boats, Polynesian canoes. Even the best examples are fragmented, fragile, reconstructed guesses. Extend that clock further back, 50,000 years, 100,000 years, and the survival odds approach zero. This is why the vast majority of prehistoric tools we find are stone. Not because stone was the most important material, but because it is the one the earth cannot digest. And so, we arrive at the brutal realization. If early Homo sapiens experimented with complex society, if they built semi-permanent settlements along river mouths, if they constructed fish weirs, if they lashed together ocean-going rafts, if they wove fabrics or built ceremonial wooden circles, we would not know. Almost none of it would survive. Even the cultural signals that we prize as hallmarks of humanity, cave art, figurines, symbolic carvings, are survivorship bias. Art made on rock lasts. Art made on wood, sand, skin, or song does not. This creates a blind spot in how we reconstruct the human story. Archaeologists call it negative evidence. If we do not find something, does that mean it did not exist? Or does it mean it did not preserve? And this is where the erasure engine misleads us most. We look at the period between, say, 300,000 and 50,000 years ago, the so-called time hole, and we say, where is the symbolic culture? Where are the monuments, the graves, the art? But we are asking that question while looking at a planet that has, in effect, run a full factory reset on most of its surface. Add rising seas, swallowing an estimated 20 million square kilometers of coastal land, and the silence becomes deafening. It is not just what decays, it is what drowns. The Sunda Shelf, Doggerland, the Persian Gulf Basin, the Bering Land Bridge, the Sahul Shelf between Australia and New Guinea. These were not marginal landscapes. These were the most densely occupied, food-rich, stable environments available to Ice Age humans, and they are gone. And yet, even knowing this, we still cling to the illusion that the archaeological record is representative, that what we find is what was, when in truth, it is what lucked out. This is not to say that nothing remains. The fact that we have any record at all of ochre mines in South Africa, of engraved shells in Indonesia, of beads in Morocco, tells us that symbolic behavior was possible. It flickered, it surfaced. But the sparse nature of that record is not proof that it was rare. It may simply be that 99% of the canvas has been erased. And so the haunting question sharpens. Did Homo sapiens become symbolic thinkers, myth-makers, storytellers, ritualists, far earlier than we have credited, only to have their works obliterated by the natural entropy of the world? Is the gap in the record a reflection of their minds, or of our inability to see? Because if we imagine a culture built mostly of perishable materials, we can suddenly reconstruct an entire lost world. Villages of thatch and wood, tools of bone, shell, and fiber, boats lashed together from logs and vines, fishing communities that mastered tides, currents, and seasonal migrations, story circles around fire pits, where knowledge was encoded not in books, but in songs, dances, and remembered genealogies. It is what we see in surviving oral cultures even today. Among the San of the Kalahari, among Aboriginal Australians, among Polynesian navigators, vast, detailed systems of knowledge, astronomical, ecological, spiritual, passed entirely by voice and ritual, And yet, if every single one of those societies disappeared tomorrow, their villages abandoned, their bodies unburied, their landscapes flooded, the archaeological trace would be almost nothing. A few scattered stone tools, a few fire pits, a few bones, if we are lucky. The same is likely true for our ancestors. And if that is true, then the mystery of the 50,000-year spark takes on a new shape, because maybe the fire had been gathering all along, flickering, lighting, snuffed by drought, by flood, by volcano, by the sheer entropy of time. Maybe what happened 50,000 years ago was not the birth of culture, but the first time the conditions were right for it to stick, to snowball, to leap from band to band, coast to inland, continent to continent. Maybe the only reason the record lights up then is because the survivors finally outran the erasure engine. And so, the question looms. If humanity almost became myth makers, before, what exactly changed? Because the fire was gathering. And in the next chapter, it catches. There is a brutal truth about knowledge. It does not live in brains. It lives in networks, in groups, in communities. And if the network is too small, too scattered, or too unstable, knowledge dies. It does not matter how smart you are. It does not matter if you are the greatest innovator, the greatest musician, the most brilliant inventor to ever walk the planet. If you are one person in a group of 20 or even 100 living in isolation from others, it does not matter, because the laws of scale are merciless. This is the cold mathematics of cultural drift. It is one of the least romantic, least satisfying, but most powerful explanations for the mystery of the prehistoric time hole, for why the lights of humanity flickered but did not yet catch fire. See, for most of human history, and I mean almost all of it, Homo sapiens lived in groups of no more than 20 to 50 people, maybe up to 100 in rich environments. And across an entire continent like Africa, that meant total populations likely in the low tens of thousands, scattered, fragmented, often separated by hundreds of kilometers of desert, mountain, or hostile territory. When population density is that low, everything becomes fragile. You can invent a new tool, a fishing net, a musical instrument, a better way to start a fire. But unless that idea spreads, unless you pass it to someone else who passes it further, it dies with you, or it fades within a generation. This is not hypothetical. It is mathematics. In small populations, the rate at which knowledge gets forgotten is often faster than the rate at which it gets innovated. Languages fracture, myths splinter, skills vanish, techniques are reinvented, forgotten, then reinvented again. It happens even in recorded history. Look at Tasmania. When sea levels rose around 10,000 years ago, the island was cut off from mainland Australia. The Aboriginal Tasmanians were isolated for millennia, and over that time, some of the more complex technologies known on the mainland simply disappeared. Fishing tools, bone needles, certain fire-starting techniques. Not because the people were less intelligent, not because they regressed, but because knowledge needs a minimum population size to persist. When groups get too small, random loss dominates over innovation. Now take that and apply it to the entire world of Homo sapiens between 120,000 and 60,000 years ago. Vast, harsh landscapes, ice advancing, deserts growing, rising and falling coastlines cutting groups off from one another, no trade routes, no migrations on any significant scale, just clusters of families, bands of wanderers, each group depending entirely on its own memory, its own fragile chain of knowledge keepers. And so the pattern repeats. People figure things out, how to process certain plants, how to navigate, how to fish, how to craft composite tools using glue made from tree resin or ochre mixed with fat, and then, sometimes, it dies. A drought wipes out a group. A predator kills the wrong elder. A disease takes the last person who remembers the formula. A river changes course, forcing a relocation where that skill is no longer useful. It is an evolutionary tug-of-war, a constant balance between memory and forgetting. This is why, when we look at the archaeological record of this period, it looks patchy. Symbolic behavior lights up in one place, ochre processing at Pinnacle Point, bead making at Blombos, and then disappears again for tens of thousands of years. Advanced tools emerge at one site, then vanish from the next layer. Bone harpoons appear at Katanga in Central Africa around 90,000 years ago, far earlier than expected. But then, poof. No follow-up, no widespread adoption, just a local innovation that may or may not have survived beyond a few generations. This is not because humans were stupid. It is because the numbers were not big enough. Cultural complexity scales with population density. More people means more ideas. More people means more redundancy. If one storyteller dies, there are 3 others who remember the song. If one artisan forgets how to craft a tool, someone else can reteach it. Networks buffer loss. Networks allow skills to survive mistakes, disasters, and the randomness of life. But pre-50,000-year Homo sapiens did not yet have the numbers, or the stability. Climate did not help. Between 120,000 and 60,000 years ago, the planet was in flux. Interglacial warmth followed by sudden drought. Rainforests expanded, then contracted. Deserts appeared and vanished. Sea levels rose, then crashed. And with every shift, human populations expanded, then crashed, then expanded again. A game of demographic whiplash. This is part of why some of the most tantalizing early sparks of human creativity seem to appear near coastlines. Because coasts are reliable, they offer steady food, shellfish, seaweed, tidal pools, even when the inland deserts turn hostile. But coasts are also ephemeral. When the Ice Age ended, rising seas swallowed them, erased entire continents of evidence. The earliest places where humans may have stabilized, where knowledge might have finally begun to snowball, are now under hundreds of meters of ocean. And yet, even then, the numbers were tight. Estimates suggest that the total number of Homo sapiens alive globally during this window was smaller than the population of a modern town, maybe 20,000, maybe as low as 10,000 at certain bottlenecks, spread across an entire planet. It is a miracle anything persisted at all. This is not just a prehistoric problem. We see the same dynamics in modern data science, linguistics, and cultural anthropology. Languages spoken by fewer than 1,000 people face a near certain probability of extinction within a few generations, not because they are less functional, but because one bad flu season, one wave of migration, one famine, and the chain of memory snaps. And memory is everything. This is the tragic mathematics of the time hole. For hundreds of thousands of years, humanity had the brain, the body, the vocal cords, the curiosity, but not the numbers. Not yet. And here is the cruelest part. It only takes one good run of climate stability. One window where the rains return, the rivers flow predictably, the coastlines hold, and the game shifts. Where populations grow dense enough, connected enough, stable enough for the memory chain to get long, and stay long. Because once memory stops breaking, everything changes. No more losing the formula for glue every 3rd generation. No more forgetting how to make a net or how to navigate by the stars. No more stories dying with the grandmother who told them. For the first time, knowledge starts to accumulate. Compound. Instead of going extinct, it stacks, builds. One innovation feeds the next. Fire-hardened tools lead to projectile weapons, lead to clothing, lead to art, lead to myth, lead to the entire symbolic reality we now live in. This is the true engine of the explosion that happens around 50,000 years ago. It is not that humans got smarter. It is not that a gene switched on. It is that the numbers finally crossed the threshold. And from that point forward, the laws of scale flipped. Culture stopped dying faster than it spread. It started snowballing instead. But that is still ahead of us in this story. For now, in this precarious window between 120,000 and 60,000 years ago, the clock is ticking. The seeds are there. The sparks flicker. But the fire cannot catch. Not yet. Because the smartest person on Earth still does not matter if they live alone. But soon, they won't. In the next chapter, the world changes. The most dangerous idea in history is simple. When enough people gather, something strange happens. Something nonlinear. Something exponential. One person alone can survive. 10 people can form a group. 50 can share stories. But it is only when the population passes a certain invisible line that reality itself changes. That knowledge stops being a flickering flame and becomes a fire that never goes out. This is the threshold effect. And it may be the single biggest reason why nothing seemed to happen for 200,000 years. And then everything did. The threshold effect is not just a poetic idea. It is a mathematical certainty baked into every system that depends on networks. From neurons to cities to ecosystems to trade routes. It is the moment where a sparse, fragile network crosses the line into something dense enough, stable enough, and interconnected enough that information, once created, no longer dies faster than it spreads. It is why an internet with 2 users is useless, but one with 2 billion changes the world. It is why the first humans could carve symbols into ochre one year, only for the memory of how to do it to vanish 10 generations later, until something shifted. So what does the science actually say? The genetic models are unforgiving. For most of Homo sapiens' existence, from about 300,000 years ago until perhaps 80,000 years ago, the total global population hovered at levels smaller than most modern suburbs, maybe 20,000, often less. Genetic bottleneck data suggests there were windows where our breeding population may have dipped below 10,000. This is not a metaphor. That is the number of people alive on the entire planet. Now split that across the vast, hostile continents of Africa, broken into tiny family bands of 20 or 30 individuals, separated by hundreds of kilometers of desert, forest, or mountain. Some clusters near coasts, some clinging to river systems, some moving constantly, searching for game and water as climates shifted beneath their feet. Each group was its own fragile island of memory. A single grandmother with a song, a hunter who knew how to make a glue from resin and ochre, a shaman who remembered how to follow the stars. But if the wrong person died, if famine struck, if a river dried up, if a war band stumbled through, that memory was gone. The anthropologist James Powell, along with Stephen Shannon and Mark Thomas, built models of exactly this phenomenon. Their conclusion was brutal. In small populations, cultural complexity collapses. Random drift wipes out innovations faster than they accumulate. It is not about intelligence. It is not about creativity. It is just numbers. But as population density increases, the math flips. There is a threshold, not a precise number, but a range, where the survival of knowledge suddenly stops being fragile, where enough people are connected often enough that even if someone forgets, someone else remembers. Memory becomes redundant, and redundancy is the foundation of civilization. So when does this shift actually happen? The archaeology tells us to look between roughly 80,000 and 60,000 years ago. As the global climate began stabilizing after a brutal series of ice ages and megadroughts, certain regions became population magnets, particularly along coasts, where fishing, shellfish, and stable marine ecosystems offered a level of food security unknown to inland groups. Genetic data shows population growth accelerating. Migration corridors reopen. Groups that were once isolated begin to merge, mix, and exchange both genes and ideas. Suddenly, in the archaeological record, we start to see layers where complex tools appear and do not vanish, where ornamental shells, beads, and ochre processing sites persist over multiple generations, where burial practices hint at continuity, not just one-off experiments. This is not yet the full symbolic explosion that happens around 50,000 years ago, but it is the point where the curve starts to bend. This is the threshold effect in action. From that point forward, humanity's relationship with knowledge flips from fragile to cumulative. And that is a bigger deal than it sounds. Because once memory becomes cumulative, innovation compounds. A tool does not just get copied, it gets improved. A story does not just survive, it gets elaborated. A ritual does not just echo, it gets woven into culture, binding groups together across generations. Suddenly, the invention of fishing does not vanish when a drought wipes out one village. It spreads. The idea of pigment for skin, for art, for ritual, it does not flicker out with one death. It survives, mutates, multiplies. The genetic studies line up perfectly with the archaeology. Between 80,000 and 60,000 years ago, we see evidence of population expansions out of Africa that were not dead ends like earlier dispersals. This time, the groups had the numbers. This time, the memory survived. This is the moment when culture stops being a candle and becomes a wildfire. It does not mean that every group on Earth was suddenly painting caves or carving figurines. It does not mean that all knowledge was shared instantly. It means that for the first time, the balance had tipped. The default mode of Homo sapiens was no longer loss, it was accumulation. This is the hinge in the story of the prehistoric time hole, why nothing seemed to happen for 200,000 years. And then, around 50,000 years ago, the record explodes with symbolic artifacts, musical instruments, fishing technologies, long-distance trade, and eventually the colonization of Australia, Europe, and the Americas. The long silence was not a failure of imagination. It was a failure of scale. The numbers had not been big enough, until now. And once the threshold was crossed, it would never uncross. The curve would only go one direction from here. Up. In the next chapter, the curve bends sharper, and the explosion begins. There are moments in human history so improbable that they shouldn't have happened, and yet they did. Long before the invention of the wheel, long before writing, before metal, before agriculture, before cities, tens of thousands of years before anything we normally associate with civilization, a group of barefoot hunter-gatherers did the single most outrageous thing anyone had ever attempted. They looked out at an empty, endless horizon of open ocean and decided to cross it. This is the story of how Homo sapiens reached Australia. Roughly 65,000 years ago, give or take a few millennia, a group of humans stood on the shoreline of what is now the islands of Indonesia. Back then, sea levels were over 100 meters lower than today. Much of Southeast Asia was one connected landmass, a giant continent archaeologists call Sunda. But no matter how far sea levels dropped, Australia was never connected. Not by ice, not by land. The continent of Sahul, which combined present-day Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania into a single giant landmass, was always separated by deep, treacherous ocean channels. There was no time in the Pleistocene where you could walk there, which means someone had to sail. Let's be clear, this was not island hopping like in the Mediterranean. These were not short distances where you could see land from one shore to the next. The minimum gap was over 70 kilometers of open water, in some places more than 100 kilometers, and these were not calm, shallow seas. These were deep ocean trenches with currents, tides, and storms. This is one of the most insane things any species has ever done. But they did it. How do we know? Because the evidence is written not just in bones or tools, but in the presence of Homo sapiens themselves. By 65,000 years ago, humans were living across the vast, strange, and lethal continent of Sahul, a land filled with giant marsupial predators, wombats the size of cars, flightless birds twice the size of an ostrich, and massive reptiles. These were ecosystems unlike anything humans had ever encountered before. And yet, they thrived. The archaeological traces are clear. The Madjed Baby Rock Shelter in northern Australia holds artifacts dated to between 65 and 50,000 years ago, including ground-edge axes, ochre crayons, and grindstones. These are not the tools of accidental castaways. This is the footprint of a people who arrived and stayed. So how did they get there? There is no surviving boat, no rope, no sail. Organic materials do not survive in the humid tropics for 60,000 years. But what we do have is the inescapable logic of absence. The absence of any possible land bridge. The absence of any other way to explain how mammals from Africa, the Middle East, and Asia ended up on a continent that had been biologically isolated for over 50 million years. It could not happen by accident. Simulations have been run. If you were to take a group of hunter-gatherers and let them drift at sea, the odds of accidentally arriving in Sahul are near zero. To succeed, you need to launch multiple craft simultaneously. You need to aim. You need to coordinate. You need to know, or believe, that there is something on the other side of that blank horizon. This was not blind luck. This was intentional voyaging. And that means something even deeper. It means these humans had already crossed a cognitive threshold. a mind capable of abstraction, of planning beyond the visible, of imagining a destination that could not be seen, of designing watercraft robust enough to survive open ocean journeys, whether rafts of bamboo lashed together, dugout canoes, or reed boats sealed with resin. We do not know the precise design, but we know the mind behind it. It also means language, not just simple commands, but complex coordination. To build a craft large enough to carry people, supplies, and possibly children, you need shared knowledge. You need to pass on methods for choosing materials, assembling frames, caulking gaps, understanding tides and winds. You need collective memory. This is the point where myth begins, where someone, perhaps, pointed to the horizon and told a story of what lay beyond. And it worked. The spread into Sahul happened fast, archaeologically speaking. Within a few thousand years, Homo sapiens were not just hugging the coasts. They were moving inland, adapting to deserts, rivers, and forests. The very fact of their presence forced evolutionary changes on the native megafauna, or more accurately, drove much of it to extinction. And the story does not stop at Australia. Humans would go on to settle New Guinea, Tasmania. Later, much later, around 3,000 years ago, Polynesian navigators would take this spark to its ultimate form, crossing entire hemispheres of open ocean to reach Hawaii, Easter Island, and finally New Zealand. But it starts here, on this forgotten voyage. The leap into Sahul is one of the cleanest proofs that by 65,000 years ago, the Homo sapiens brain was operating in fully modern mode, and not just individually, but collectively. And yet, this leap happened before the great explosion of cave art in Europe, before the lion-headed figurines of Germany, before the oldest musical instruments, before agriculture, monuments, cities, or writing. They could cross oceans, but they were still thousands of years away from building anything permanent. It is one of the great paradoxes of human history. The mind was ready, the imagination was active, but the symbolic explosion that would leave an undeniable global record was still waiting. The spark was there, but the fire was still gathering. And in the next chapter, the world lights up. If the story of reaching Sahul is the story of crossing water, then the story of the human mind in this moment is about something even bigger. Because this is not just a story of travel. This is the birth of something fundamentally new. The ability to navigate landscapes that do not yet exist. The ability to move through invisible worlds, through memory, through imagination, through shared collective maps that live not on paper, but inside the mind. And that changes everything. Because to cross an ocean you cannot see across. You first have to build a map you cannot see at all. A map built out of imagination, out of language, out of story. Think about what it really means to look at an empty horizon. No land visible. No birds signaling what lies ahead. No smoke rising from distant fires. Just water. Just distance. And then, to decide to leave. To launch. To trust in something that cannot be seen. This is not instinct. This is not animal migration. This is not following a scent trail or the seasonal pull of the stars. This is abstract thinking in its purest form. It is the ability to represent reality not as it appears, but as it might be. It means that by 65,000 years ago, the Homo sapiens brain was doing something that no other species on Earth, not even Neanderthals or Denisovans, had ever quite pulled off. The construction of cognitive maps, the ability to hold a mental model of space, distance, direction, and probability, and not just hold it, but share it. Because a voyage like this is not a solo act. This requires teaching, conversation, argument, consensus. Someone says, "We think there is land that way." Someone else says, "We saw birds flying in that direction weeks ago." Another remembers that the tides shift with the moon. Another knows how to cut reeds, how to lash wood, how to caulk seams with tree resin. Another knows how long to pack food for. Another decides when to go. And none of this is written down. It lives in memory, in story, in song, in the shared spoken weave of the tribe's knowledge. This is where myth begins, not in the sense of falsehood, but in the sense of a story that holds a truth bigger than data. A story that says, Beyond that horizon there is a place, whether anyone has been there or not. And this raises the bigger question. What is the mind that can do this? Neuroscientists call it symbolic cognition, the ability to let one thing stand for another, a word for a place, a pattern for a direction, a plan for a future event that has not happened yet. It is the same mind that can imagine a god, or a law, or a story. It is the mind that can name something invisible, and then act as if it's real. But it is also collective cognition, because no one person knows everything. No one brain can store the full map. It lives in the group. Each person holds a piece. This is what cognitive archaeologists call cumulative culture, the great engine of humanity, the thing no other animal, no other hominin, fully mastered. A chimpanzee learns by watching. A crow figures out how to bend a wire into a hook, but their knowledge dies with them. It resets each generation. There is no snowball effect. But humans pass it on. They teach. They tell. And every generation starts not from zero, but from the edge of what the last one knew. And that means the curve bends upwards. Voyaging is a stress test for the human brain. It forces everything into alignment. Planning, cooperation, risk management, resource tracking, weather prediction, craftsmanship, language, memory, ritual. Because you do not cross 100 kilometers of open sea without a story that says, it is possible, a story that says, it has been done, or it will be done. This is also the first glimpse of future technologies that won't appear for tens of thousands of years. A boat is a machine, a complex technological system. It requires not just knowledge but synthesis, how to turn the properties of wood, fiber, and buoyancy into something that floats, carries weight, and holds together against waves. It is the same mental architecture that will later build bridges, temples, cities, telescopes. The brain that sails is the brain that someday will fly. And yet, notice the paradox. These voyagers did not yet farm. They did not build monuments. They left no writing, no permanent settlements. Their houses were still made of branches and skins. Their dead were not yet buried with vast grave goods. Their walls bore no paintings of mammoths or gods. The mind had arrived, but the world it would build had not yet begun. Why? Why could they cross oceans, but not yet invent the village? The answer is scale. A boat needs a few people, a band, a tribe, but a city needs hundreds, thousands, a surplus of food, a structure of authority, systems of trade. It requires the ecological, demographic, and social conditions that, in 65,000 years ago, simply did not yet exist. But the mind was ready. The leap into Sahul is not just a story of migration, it is a proof of concept for humanity itself. Proof that the mind had crossed its own invisible ocean, from a world of instincts and immediacy into a world of abstraction, planning, and collective imagination. And yet, this is still not the famous explosion. Not yet. But look closely. The wave is rising, population densities are growing, climatic windows are opening, migrations are spreading, genetic flows are mixing. And then, somewhere around 50,000 years ago, the curve tips. The archaeological record catches fire. The first bone flutes, the first cave paintings, the first figurines, the first burial rites with grave goods, pigments, and offerings. The first fully modern human culture, appearing not as a slow fade, but as an explosion. The fire catches, and in the next part, the world lights up. It happens everywhere, all at once, or at least that is how it looks from the shattered mirror of the archaeological record. A pattern so strange, so sudden, that for nearly a century, scientists argued whether it was even real. Because around 50,000 to 45,000 years ago, something erupts in the human story. Not in one place, not in one continent, but simultaneously across the edges of the world. And that something is meaning. shared meaning, symbolic meaning, memory turned visible. Deep in the limestone caves of southern France, a hand smears red ochre across a wall. A few steps further, someone grinds black manganese into a powder and mixes it with fat. In the flickering light of a fire, they draw. A bison, mid-charge. A lion, jaw open. Horses with flowing manes. Antelopes frozen mid-stride, their hooves nearly floating off the stone. Not doodles, not decoration. These images are anatomical, dynamic, alive. These are not just pictures of animals. They are the memories of animals, the spirits of animals, the imagined presence of things not there. Chauvet Cave, 36,000 years old, or maybe older. And yet, as the carbon dates began to roll in during the late 20th century, it became clear that Chauvet was not the beginning. It was one branch on a fire that was already spreading. Because halfway across the world, on the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia, a human hand presses pigment against a cave wall. When archaeologists finally carbon dated the calcite that formed over the paint, the results stunned the world. 45,000 years ago, a negative handprint, a ghost of flesh left in stone, and beside it, a babirusa, a pig deer, rendered with curves and lines that would not look out of place in any art museum on Earth. And then another shock, El Castillo Cave in northern Spain. A series of red dots, some smeared, some precise, some forming shapes that look almost like constellations. Dated to at least 40,000 years ago, possibly older. 3 continents, separated by tens of thousands of kilometers. Populations that have not seen each other for tens of millennia. And yet, the same behavior, the same eruption of images into the world. Why? Why now? For 200,000 years, anatomically modern humans walked the earth. They made spears, they knapped stone, they used fire, they foraged, hunted, survived. Occasionally they scratched a pattern on an ochre chunk, maybe drilled a hole in a shell. But nothing that looks like this. Nothing like Chauvet. Nothing like Sulawesi. Nothing like El Castillo. And then, around 50,000 years ago, it is as if someone flipped a switch in the human mind. But of course, it was not a switch. It was a curve. A curve that had finally reached its tipping point. The threshold had been crossed. Population density had risen. Networks were stable. Knowledge was being passed, preserved, amplified. Language had reached the fidelity needed to describe not just things, but ideas. Not just a lion, but the spirit of lion, the story of lion, the power of lion. This is the moment when the mind becomes mythic. Because cave art is not merely illustration. These are not field guides to local fauna. This is ritual. This is magic. This is the attempt to control, honor, summon, or appease the forces that shape survival. The hunters step into the darkness, a womb of stone, and paint the thing they seek, the thing they fear, the thing they follow. And the handprints are even stranger. A negative hand, a silhouette made by placing a hand against the wall and blowing pigment around it. Why? Is it a signature, a statement, a spell? Is it the declaration, I was here? Or is it the plea, remember me? Or is it the offering, I belong to this place, this lineage, this story? And it is not just Europe, not just Indonesia, not just Spain. In Namibia, the Apollo 11 cave yields slabs of painted stone, some of the oldest figurative art in Africa. In Australia, rock shelters bear images of kangaroos, emus, and geometric patterns that may date back tens of thousands of years beyond what was once thought possible. In the Kimberley region, figures with halo-like headgear and exaggerated limbs, the guion style, suggest a visual language passed across thousands of generations. And wherever it appears, it comes with the same package. Pigments, patterns, carved objects, beads strung into necklaces, bone tools shaped into needles, shells carried hundreds of kilometers inland, traded, valued, symbolic. And alongside the visual comes the auditory. The oldest known musical instruments appear. Flutes carved from bird bone and mammoth ivory, 40,000 years old, maybe older, which means the cave is not silent. As the lines of pigment take shape, someone is playing, someone is singing. The walls echo not just with images, but with sound, with memory. This is not survival behavior. This is not merely utilitarian. This is the birth of symbolic culture. A lion is not just a lion. It is a symbol. A horse is not just a horse. It is a story. And a hand is not just a hand. It is a claim, a presence, a bridge between the living and the dead, between now and forever. Why this, and why now? The standard archaeological answer is a mix of things: population growth, climate stability, expanding social networks, the rise of complex language, the accumulation of knowledge reaching a critical mass. But it also may be something else. The neuroscientists argue that the brain was not just getting bigger, it was getting better at certain types of recursion, the ability to embed stories within stories, to imagine the thoughts of others, to visualize not just what is, but what could be, what might be, what should be. A recursive mind is a dangerous thing. It can imagine gods, laws, futures. It can imagine that a red dot on a cave wall means something. That meaning itself exists. This is the birth of abstraction. And the strange thing is how universal it is. Whether in France, Indonesia, Spain, Africa, Australia, the moment is the same. The shapes are the same. Hands, animals, grids, spirals, dots, lines. Not just representations, but symbols. The symbols echo through tens of thousands of years, through extinction events, through migrations, through empires yet unborn. The cave becomes cathedral. The pigment becomes scripture. The handprint becomes the contract with the future. Because to make a mark is to declare, I am part of something larger than myself, larger than this moment, larger than this life. And once that declaration is made, it cannot be unmade. This is the line between the animal and the symbolic ape, the line between surviving and remembering, the line between being alive and knowing that you are alive. And yet, it does not stop here. Because as the caves light up, the world itself begins to transform. The hunters become explorers. The explorers become settlers. The settlers become storytellers. And in the next part, we follow that story, out of Africa, across the frozen plains, into the unknown. It begins quietly, not with a shout, but with a whisper woven from bone, ochre, and song. 50,000 years ago, something strange starts appearing across the archaeological record. Not just in one place, but almost everywhere Homo sapiens existed. This was no isolated phenomenon. It was as if the minds of our species, scattered across continents, suddenly flipped the same invisible switch. Tiny holes drilled into snail shells, strings of beads worn as necklaces or woven into garments, carefully folded bodies, buried with red ochre smeared over skin and bone. Sometimes alongside tools, sometimes with carved figurines, sometimes with nothing but the pigment itself. And in caves, where the sun never reaches, humans etched, painted, and sculpted meaning onto stone walls that had only ever known wind and silence. This is where the timeline fractures. For over 200,000 years, anatomically modern humans had walked the earth with barely a footprint of symbolic thought. Survival, yes. Spears, yes. Fire, yes. But symbols, myth, music, almost nothing. Then, all at once, meaning appears. Not as a whisper at the edges, but as an explosion. Across Europe, in the caves of what we now call France, Spain, and Germany, Homo sapiens, and perhaps even the last Neanderthals, were creating what are now the oldest known musical instruments. Flutes carved from vulture bones like those found in the Hohl Fels cave in Germany, dated to roughly 43 to 44,000 years ago. Think about that. Music existed long before cities, before writing, before agriculture. Before the idea of a king or a priest, there was a melody. A breath pushed through a hollowed bone, vibrating the air, vibrating the soul. Alongside those instruments were beads, thousands of them, in caves, in open-air sites, in burials, some carved from ivory, others from bone, shell, or even mammoth tusk, each with deliberate holes drilled through, polished by hands that likely spent hours crafting them. These were not functional tools. They were markers of identity, status, belonging, or maybe something even deeper, something like prayer. Then the burials. Ochre-stained graves appear with increasing frequency during this window of time. In Sunghir, Russia, a site dating to around 34,000 years ago but likely building on traditions that began earlier, 2 children were found buried head-to-head, their bodies adorned with more than 10,000 ivory beads, painstakingly sewn into garments. It is a staggering display of labor for no practical return. These children would never hunt, never gather, never produce. But the people who buried them spent weeks, maybe months, crafting their burial clothes. This is not survival behavior. This is meaning. And the ochre. Always the ochre. Red as blood, as the sunset, as the inside of the body. It appears smeared on bones, sprinkled over corpses, mixed into pigments for art. It appears in Africa, in Europe, in Southeast Asia. Wherever Homo sapiens wandered, ochre came with them. Scientists debate its meaning. Was it symbolic of life, of death, of the earth, of the sacred? Or was it simply tradition, a thing done because it had always been done? In a way, that question is the answer, because tradition itself is memory turned into ritual, and ritual is culture. All of this, the music, the beads, the burials, the pigment, emerges within the same narrow stretch of time as the first cave paintings. This is no coincidence. What we are seeing in the archaeological record is not just a change in tools, but a change in cognition. The mind itself reorganizes. Cognitive scientists call this the appearance of recursive thought, the ability to imagine abstractions nested within abstractions. Not just a deer, but the idea of a deer. Not just a friend, but the memory of a friend. Not just an object, but a symbol representing something else entirely. This is the architecture of story, the foundation of myth. Consider Sulawesi, Indonesia. In caves there, humans left hand stencils and paintings of wild pigs over 45,000 years ago, older than most of the famous European art. These were not mere decorations. The act of placing one's hand against stone and blowing pigment around it is a declaration, a ghost signature, a message to the future. I was here, I existed, I mattered. And so the pattern repeats. In El Castillo, Spain, red discs and handprints dated to at least 40,000 years ago. In Chauvet, France, lions, rhinos, mammoths, painted with dynamic motion, with shadow, with attention to muscle and breath and life. These were not doodles, these were visions. And it wasn't only visual. Bone flutes mean soundscapes, beads mean fashion and identity, burial means remembrance, and all of it together means something else entirely, a mind aware of its own mortality and of its place in the cosmos. But was this the destination, or was it merely the ignition point? Because from here, everything accelerates. Myth becomes language, memory becomes genealogy, music becomes ceremony, and the humble ochre-smeared burial evolves over tens of thousands of years into pyramids, cathedrals, and space probes. And yet, it also raises a haunting question. Why then, if Homo sapiens had the same brain architecture for hundreds of thousands of years, if the genetic toolkit was already there, why didn't this explosion happen earlier? Why not 200,000 years ago? Why not 300,000? The archaeological record holds one more clue, a strange one. Even after the emergence of this symbolic mind, even after the art, the music, the myth, it doesn't happen everywhere. Entire regions seem to miss it or adopt it slowly. This wasn't a switch flipped universally. It was a fire passed hand to hand. And sometimes, that fire went out. But that's for the next chapter. Because once the mind awakened, the question was no longer whether humans could create meaning. The question became, what would they do with it? For more than 250,000 years, anatomically modern humans walked this planet with brains just as large, just as complex, and just as capable as yours. They made spears, shaped stone, used fire, and perhaps even mourned their dead. But they did not paint on cave walls. They did not carve gods from ivory. They did not invent music, mythology, or complex social contracts that outlasted their own lives. Not yet. Then, as if someone flipped a switch buried deep in the folds of the human mind, it began. 50,000 years ago, give or take a few millennia, humans everywhere began erupting with symbols. Burials grew rich with ochre and grave goods. Beads, pendants, and tattoos started tracking identity. Musical instruments appeared. And on the walls of caves from France to Sulawesi, ghostly hands and wild herds began to shimmer in firelight. The most persistent question in anthropology, the one that haunts the entire prehistoric record, is painfully simple. Why then? Why not 100,000 years ago when humans were already voyaging beyond Africa? Why not 200,000 years ago when our species first took shape in the sands of Morocco? And why not later? Why not 40,000 years ago or 30,000, if the ingredients were already scattered across the planet waiting to be assembled? And perhaps the most unsettling corollary of all, was it inevitable, or was it luck? For decades, the simplest and most seductive answer came from genetics. Maybe it was a mutation. Maybe sometime between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago, a single genetic shift rewired the brain. Not a new brain structure, but a tweak to how existing regions connected. The prime suspect was a gene called FOXP2. Discovered in the late 1990s while studying a family with profound language impairments, FOXP2 became known in the press as the language gene. People carrying rare mutations in this gene struggle with grammar, verbal coordination, and the complex motor tasks required for speech. Scientists wondered, could this gene be the trigger? At first, the evidence seemed promising. FOXP2 regulates the expression of dozens of other genes involved in brain development, particularly those affecting the basal ganglia and motor control. It is heavily involved in learning sequences, whether that means stringing together syllables or stitching together the rules of grammar. If this gene had mutated at the right moment, perhaps it allowed humans to transcend the limitations of working memory, transforming isolated symbols into complex language. And with language came culture. But then came the twist. In 2007, a team of geneticists working under Svante Pääbo sequenced the FOXP2 gene from Neanderthal DNA. The result was shocking. Neanderthals carried the exact same version. Whatever FOXP2 was doing, it was not unique to Homo sapiens. The gene predated the symbolic explosion by at least 100,000 years, possibly more. That discovery did not kill the genetics hypothesis entirely. It just made it more complicated. Instead of a single mutation, researchers began looking at polygenic models, cascades of tiny genetic tweaks, each affecting cognition, memory, or vocal coordination in subtle ways. Genes regulating synaptic plasticity, dopamine modulation, or working memory became candidates. But no single gene has emerged as a smoking gun, at least not yet. If genetics was not enough, what about the world itself? Could the environment hold the key? For much of the late Pleistocene, humanity was locked in a brutal game of survival against the planet itself. Between 180,000 and 120,000 years ago, Africa swung between mega-droughts and lush green corridors with frightening speed. Population bottlenecks were common. The famous Toba supervolcano eruption around 74,000 years ago blanketed the sky in ash, likely triggering a volcanic winter that drove Homo sapiens to the brink of extinction. In this view, the symbolic explosion did not come from mutation, it came from stability. Around 60,000 years ago, climate patterns calmed. Wetter, more stable periods returned to key corridors along African coasts and river systems. Food became more reliable, populations grew, and critically, groups began interacting more frequently. Which leads to the next theory, the network model. Culture is not an invention, it is a network effect. Imagine a single brilliant individual, someone who, by accident or design, invents a new fishing hook, or a story about the moon, or a way to keep fire burning through the night. If that person dies before teaching anyone else, the invention dies with them, forever. This is cultural drift, the tendency for innovations to vanish when populations are too small or too isolated to sustain them. But when population density reaches a certain threshold, something changes. Knowledge stops dying faster than it spreads. Ideas begin to stack. Skills compound. Children grow up surrounded by elders who pass on not just survival tricks, but stories, songs, beliefs, and collective memory. In 2009, a landmark paper by Shannon, Powell, and Thomas demonstrated this mathematically. Using models drawn from evolutionary biology, they showed that once human group sizes crossed a critical threshold, perhaps between a few hundred and a few thousand individuals, innovation began to snowball. More brains meant more error correction. More peers meant more chances to learn, iterate, and refine. This was not a gradual curve. It was a tipping point. This matches the archaeological record disturbingly well. Sites dated before 60,000 years ago show sporadic flashes of symbolic behavior. Engraved ochre here, shell beads there, but the flame never catches. Then, after 60,000, it appears everywhere, across continents, cultures, and climates. But even this raises a haunting question. If the engine was always population, why did it wait until then? Humans had spread into the Middle East by 100,000 years ago, and possibly into China even earlier. Were those populations too small, too transient, or was there still something else missing? Some researchers point to the role of stochastic events, what statisticians call chance clustering. Even if the ingredients for symbolic culture existed for 100,000 years, maybe the right conditions, the right people, the right trade routes, the right confluence of ecological bounty and social density only happened to line up once. If so, the symbolic explosion was not inevitable. It was an accident, a one-time spark in the chaos of deep time. Others lean toward a different idea. Maybe it was not about biology or population or climate at all. Maybe the problem was time. Culture, after all, is a cumulative ratchet. It takes generations to build the scaffolding of knowledge. The first hunter who decorates a spear thrower may not realize they are inventing art. But the fifth generation does. The first person who scratches a symbol into ochre may be doing it absent-mindedly, but their grandchildren inherit it as meaning. In this view, the explosion at 50,000 years ago was not a miracle. It was just the inevitable culmination of hundreds of thousands of years of tiny, forgotten experiments, the gradual layering of skills, habits, and cognitive shortcuts until the dam finally broke. And yet, the truth may be even more unsettling. Perhaps there was no singular cause at all. The symbolic explosion may be a textbook case of what complexity scientists call emergence, like how consciousness arises from neurons firing, or how an ant colony organizes with no leader. The birth of meaning itself may have been an emergent property of millions of small factors, none sufficient on their own. A fragile dance between genes, climate, demography, memory, and pure random chance. And if that is true, then the next question is even bigger. What did they do with the new mind they had just unlocked? Somewhere around 50,000 years ago, something irreversible happened, something strange, something so sudden in the grand sweep of time that for decades archaeologists argued whether it was even real. A great rupture, a curve that had crawled horizontally for hundreds of thousands of years, bent upwards. The archaeological record erupts. Art, ornamentation, musical instruments, burial with grave goods, bone needles, fishing hooks, ceremonial ochre, beads, carvings, and the unmistakable scratch marks of story, not in words, not yet, but in symbols, in patterns, in memory mapped onto objects. And it happens not in one place, but everywhere. From the limestone caves of France to the volcanic walls of Sulawesi, from the red ochre sands of southern Africa to the coastal cliffs of Australia, at the same time, almost as if the world itself took a breath and exhaled meaning. But why then? Why not earlier? Why not at Blombos Cave, 140,000 years ago when the first ochre engravings and shell beads appeared? Why not 200,000 years ago when fully modern Homo sapiens already walked the plains of Ethiopia? Why not even earlier when Homo erectus, with a brain two-thirds the size of ours, had already mastered fire, sea voyaging, and likely crafted wooden tools now long vanished beneath the tides of time? The question has gnawed at archaeology for decades. Why did the symbolic explosion not happen until it did? And the answer, it turns out, is not one answer at all. It is not a single gene. It is not a single invention. It is not a single shaman sitting alone in a cave, sketching the first metaphor onto stone. It is what scientists now call a complex convergence, a fire meeting the right fuel, under the right conditions, at the right time. First, there were the genes. For years, the FOXP2 gene carried the burden of public fascination, nicknamed the language gene, after studies of a British family with a speech disorder tied to its mutation. But the story is now far more complicated. By the year 2007, it was confirmed that Neanderthals shared the exact same FOXP2 variant as Homo sapiens. Further genomic studies revealed that FOXP2 is not a language switch. It is a regulatory gene, one cog in a vast machinery of neural development, motor control, and vocal learning. Yes, it is necessary for speech, but no, it is not sufficient for meaning. In fact, the key was never one gene, but a whole architecture of neurological wiring. Genes for social cognition, genes for memory consolidation, genes that fine-tuned the prefrontal cortex, that strange slab of biological meat behind your forehead where long-term planning, imagination, and inhibition collide. By 50,000 years ago, these genes had stabilized in our population, inherited through both Homo sapiens lineages, as the 2023 weakly structured stem model shows, and cross-fertilized with fragments of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA. But genetic capacity is only capacity. The fire needed fuel. That fuel was population. The Powell, Shannon, and Thomas model from 2009 proved something almost embarrassingly simple. Complex culture cannot survive in small groups. Innovations die faster than they spread. A single genius who invents the bow cannot preserve the bow if they die before teaching it. Oral tradition requires redundancy. Memory requires backup. And prior to 60,000 years ago, Homo sapiens lived in extremely low-density populations, sometimes under 10,000 breeding individuals globally. Entire regions may have been populated by a few hundred people scattered across thousands of square kilometers. Knowledge was brittle. A single drought could erase a story. A single migration failure could obliterate a technology. But as climate began to stabilize after the harsh swings of the marine isotope stage 6 glaciation, something shifted. Coasts opened, rivers flowed steadily, rain cycles normalized in Africa, the Levant, and Southeast Asia. Populations grew, networks expanded, ideas now had scaffolding. You could teach a song to your children and trust that it would reach your grandchildren. But it was not just genes and not just numbers. It was cognition itself changing form, or rather, being fully unlocked. Anthropologists call it cognitive modernity. Not just tool use, not just fire, not just hunting strategies, but recursive thinking, symbolic abstraction, the ability to think about thinking, to imagine things that do not exist, to invent gods, ghosts, ancestors, and futures. This is not a small upgrade. It is the difference between remembering that a lion lives near the river and imagining a lion spirit who guards the river, whose anger causes floods, whose appeasement ensures safety. Myth, law, morality, society, all scaffolded on symbols. But even recursive thinking was not enough. It required embodiment, the tools to carry memory, beads, ochre, carvings, markings, objects that stored identity outside the brain. What neuroscientists now call cognitive offloading, turning the fragile electricity of memory into durable physical forms, a songline etched into a cliff, a lineage encoded in bead patterns, a map inscribed on a drumbeat. And finally, perhaps the most uncomfortable variable of all, stochastic chance, luck. There is no cosmic law that says Homo sapiens had to survive. Genetic bottlenecks, like the Toba supervolcano around 74,000 years ago, nearly erased us. Climate oscillations regularly crashed populations to near extinction. A slightly colder ice age, a slightly drier century, a single pathogen. And this story would not exist. There is nothing inevitable about the human explosion. No manifest destiny of consciousness, no grand plan of the universe, just a cascade of contingent events that happened, for a brief geological instant, to line up. So around 50,000 years ago, the curve bent upwards. Genes, population, stability, networks, memory, symbolism, the fire caught. And once it caught, it never went out. From that moment onward, every single human being who has ever lived in a world saturated with symbols, with meaning, with stories, and we have never, not once, gone back. And yet, this is not the climax of the story. It is only the beginning. Because once the mind unlocked, the consequences would be far more dangerous, far more beautiful, and far more irreversible than anything that came before. For hundreds of thousands of years, the stage was set. All the pieces were scattered across the board. The genes were there. The hands that shaped tools were there. Even the sparks of symbolic thought, those early beads, ochre marks, and half-forgotten lines in the sand, were already flashing on and off in isolated corners of the world. And yet, it was as if something fundamental about the system refused to connect. Ideas would emerge, and then vanish. Techniques would evolve, and then evaporate. There was no staircase yet, no upward curve, just a long, erratic heartbeat, one pulse every few millennia, echoing into the dark, until it changed. What finally tipped the balance was not a single breakthrough, but an intersection, an overlap, the alignment of variables that, alone, meant little, but together, unlocked everything. First, the biological scaffolding. By 50,000 years ago, the neurological machinery inside the Homo sapiens skull had quietly crossed an invisible line. This was not about the sudden arrival of genius or some mythical leap in intelligence. It was about threshold complexity, brain circuits dedicated to recursion, the ability to layer thoughts inside other thoughts. Networks for long-term memory retrieval. Prefrontal systems wired not just for reacting to the environment, but for simulating futures that did not yet exist. This was the hardware capable of imagination, capable of anxiety, capable of crafting meaning from nothing. But even the most advanced mind collapses in isolation. And that was the second axis, demography. For most of the human timeline, people lived in numbers too small to sustain complex culture. Innovations flickered out faster than they could spread. A group that figured out how to weave fiber or preserve meat would vanish in a drought, and the knowledge would vanish with them. There was no backup system. But population models show that somewhere between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago, human communities finally reached density thresholds where cultural knowledge stopped blinking out and began compounding. And this had a cascade effect. Because when more people cluster together, not just spatially but socially, the total number of possible interactions explodes. Language accelerates. Teaching accelerates. Mistakes and corrections pile on top of one another fast enough to refine technologies in ways no isolated band could ever achieve. What emerges is not just additive knowledge, but emergent knowledge. Ideas that no individual could invent alone. But the world itself played its hand as well. After 200,000 years of volatile ice age climate, endless cycles of megadrought, sudden cold snaps, collapsing ecosystems, the period between roughly 70,000 and 50,000 years ago saw an unusual window of relative climate stability across key regions of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Rainfall patterns stabilized. Coastlines became accessible. Food webs became more predictable. In short, the Earth stopped kicking the table over every few generations. And stability breeds storage. For the first time, humans could build cumulative systems of memory, whether that meant oral narratives, shared myths, or external symbols carved into objects. And then came the final multiplier. Social structure itself shifted. We have genetic and archaeological evidence suggesting that during this period, kinship networks expanded dramatically. Trade routes appear between groups previously isolated. Genetic lineages mix not just locally but across entire continents. Marriage rules begin to evolve toward exogamy, the practice of marrying outside one's group, which forces alliances, reciprocal obligations, and the cross-pollination of both genes and ideas. The brain was ready, the numbers were ready, the planet was finally quiet enough, and the social web snapped taut. It was not a eureka moment. No single person woke up and invented art, religion, science, and music before breakfast. It was an emergent property, the kind of shift that only appears when a system passes a saturation point. The same way that ice does not become water slowly, but all at once when the temperature passes a threshold. 50,000 years ago, the threshold cracked. From that point forward, memory itself became an external process, no longer limited to brains alone, but carried in objects, rituals, rhythms, pigments, and patterns. Knowledge became recursive, knowledge about knowledge. Story became a technology, identity became a portable artifact. And from there, the dominoes fall faster than anyone could have imagined. Within 5,000 years, humans reach Australia, across open ocean, navigating toward a continent they could not see. Within another 10,000, the first carvings of lions with human heads appear in Europe, beings that never existed in nature, but lived richly inside the mind. Within another 10,000, the glimmer of agriculture, sedentism, temples, cities. The spark was not the mystery. The mystery was why it took so long for the right winds, the right fuel, and the right friction to converge. Because once the mechanism snapped into place, it was irreversible. What came next was both inevitable and catastrophic, for better and for worse. And that is the story we now have to live inside. Shall we? Because the consequences are everything. It never really stopped. What began in the glow of firelight on cave walls, in the steady hands that carved beads from bone, in the first whispered myths beneath the stars, did not end. It accelerated. Because the so-called explosion of meaning around 50,000 years ago was not a singular event. It was not a finish line. It was the ignition of a self-feeding loop, a feedback system built from memory, recursion, and connection. A pattern that once triggered would never settle back into silence. Because when a human draws a shape on a wall, ties a story to a place, or teaches a child a song that outlives their own body, that information stops being biological. It exits the fragile meat of the brain and enters the world itself. It becomes part of external memory, no longer limited by the lifespan of neurons. And the more memory escapes the skull, the faster it snowballs. That is the real legacy of the 50,000-year explosion. A recursive loop between minds, artifacts, and symbols that accelerates not by linear progress, but by exponential recursion. Each generation inherits not only its own discoveries, but the discoveries of every generation that came before it, compressed, remixed, and handed forward. The Ice Age shamans who mapped mammoth migration onto cave walls were doing the same thing that modern data scientists do when they plot trends. The same thing priests did when they etched sacred geometry into temples. The same thing programmers do when they write code. It is all the same pattern. Compress information into symbols, transmit it, remix it, and build something new. And once this symbolic recursion ignited, it transformed everything. The first leap was from cave paintings to carved idols, then from idols to rituals, from rituals to language, from language to writing, from writing to cities, contracts, calendars, religions, from clay tablets to codices, from printing presses to radio waves, from silicon chips to cloud servers. A chain of memory that started with ochre-stained fingertips pressing into limestone and now stretches into the blinking data centers that hum beneath our feet. It never really stopped. What began in the glow of firelight on cave walls, in the steady hands that carved beads from bone, in the first whispered myths beneath the stars, did not end. It accelerated. Because the so-called explosion of meaning around 50,000 years ago was not a singular event. It was not a finish line. It was the ignition of a self-feeding loop, a feedback system built from memory, recursion, and connection. A pattern that once triggered would never settle back into silence. Because when a human draws a shape on a wall, ties a story to a place, or teaches a child a song that outlives their own body, that information stops being biological. It exits the fragile meat of the brain and enters the world itself. It becomes part of external memory, no longer limited by the lifespan of neurons. And the more memory escapes the skull, the faster it snowballs. That is the real legacy of the 50,000-year explosion. A recursive loop between minds, artifacts, and symbols that accelerates not by linear progress, but by exponential recursion. Each generation inherits not only its own discoveries, but the discoveries of every generation that came before it, compressed, remixed, and handed forward. The Ice Age shamans who mapped mammoth migration onto cave walls were doing the same thing that modern data scientists do when they plot trends. The same thing priests did when they etched sacred geometry into temples. The same thing programmers do when they write code. It is all the same pattern. Compress information into symbols, transmit it, remix it, and build something new. And once this symbolic recursion ignited, it transformed everything. The first leap was from cave paintings to carved idols, then from idols to rituals, from rituals to language, from language to writing, from writing to cities, contracts, calendars, religions, from clay tablets to codices, from printing presses to radio waves, from silicon chips to cloud servers. A chain of memory that started with ochre-stained fingertips pressing into limestone and now stretches into the blinking data centers that hum beneath our feet. So here is the question no one really knows how to ask out loud. What if the so-called explosion never actually ended? What if the great acceleration of 50,000 years ago is not a past event, but an ongoing process? A runaway pattern that simply shifted platforms? What if the time hole was never closed? It just moved faster and smaller, from pigments to pixels, from ochre to code. Because when you step back far enough, when you squint at the long, slow arc of human history, the lines begin to blur. The difference between a hunter etching marks into stone and an engineer encoding data onto silicon starts to feel less like a civilizational leap and more like an inevitable mutation of the same recursive loop. The problem is not that the past is distant, it is that it never really left. Look carefully enough at any piece of modern technology, your phone, your bank account, the streaming server delivering this story into your headphones, and you will see the exact same structure that powered the Ice Age brain. Symbols mapped onto reality, tools for compressing meaning, shared memory extended outside the body. A cave wall is a screen. A fingerprint in ochre is a login credential. A constellation mapped onto the sky is not so different from a data graph plotted onto a dashboard. The only thing that changed is bandwidth. Because the explosion was never about the invention of tools, it was about the invention of memory outside the flesh, of thought that could outlive the thinker, of recursion that feeds forward. Each generation no longer starts from zero. Each new sapien plugs into the accumulated memory of every sapien before them. Stories, tools, language, law, myth, mathematics, infrastructure. A scaffolding of ghosts. And every leap since, agriculture, writing, metallurgy, printing, radio, the internet, is simply another amplifier strapped onto the same feedback loop. We think of history as linear. We narrate it as steps. But it is not steps. It is acceleration curves stacked inside acceleration curves. The line goes up, and it keeps going. Even the concept of a timeline is a trick of the pattern, because when you look at it closely, there is no straight line, only loops. Feedback, recursion. The present is a remix of the past. The future is a recursive branch of memory structures already unfolding, and so the haunting possibility emerges, that the so-called time hole never actually closed, that the strange, ghostly silence we spent hundreds of thousands of years trapped in was never fully escaped, that we are still running the same loop, faster, louder, more chaotic, but still fundamentally the same. Because if culture is an exponential memory system, if the symbolic mind is a recursive engine, then the explosion never ends. It compounds. Which means the digital age is not the successor to the Paleolithic. It is the metastasis of it. A social media feed is a cave wall with infinite handprints, scrawled by strangers you will never meet. A blockchain is just an over-engineered mnemonic device, a memory palace for a civilization that forgot how to trust. An algorithm is just an elder's story, retold by a machine that never sleeps. And the most unsettling thing is this: it still obeys the same rules, the same bottlenecks of scale, transmission, and noise. False memories go viral. Bad information outcompetes good. Ritual collapses into repetition. meaning competes with noise until the system buckles or evolves. The question is not whether the 50,000-year explosion ended. The question is whether it has outpaced us, whether the feedback loop we built now runs faster than the primate hardware it evolved on, whether the fire we stole from the gods still heats the tribe, or whether it now burns uncontrolled. Because the pattern has no brake pedal. It accelerates until something breaks, a bottleneck, a collapse, a revolution, and then it accelerates again. And that leaves us staring at the same haunting horizon as the first sapiens who painted hands on limestone 45,000 years ago. The same question whispered into firelight beneath the stars. What are we now? What do we become? When the memory never stops growing, but the mind stays the same. It turns out the time hole never closed. The fire never went out. We just changed the walls we paint on, and the recursion continues. And the recursion. All right, so now you know. The fire never really started 50,000 years ago, because it was never a fire. It was a chain reaction, a recursion, memory stacked on memory, until the stack was tall enough to survive gravity. And from that moment, it never stopped growing. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The gap, the time hole, the long silence that haunts the archaeological record, it never actually ended. We just filled it with faster tools, bigger mirrors, higher bandwidth, from ochre dots on cave walls to pixels on touchscreens, from oral histories told under stars to cloud backups spinning in server farms, from clans fighting with spears to clans fighting with memes. The pattern never ended. It only accelerated. And the question those first two scripts asked, the question that still sits there, heavy, unavoidable, isn't just about what happened 50,000 years ago. It's whether it's still happening. Whether the fire we mistake for progress is actually just the same recursion loop running faster, higher, and thinner. Until one day, like all fragile memory networks before it, it collapses. Because that's the other thing the time hole teaches us. Culture isn't permanent. Memory isn't guaranteed. What we mistake for inevitability, for destiny, was always just statistical luck, stacked on the graves of forgotten experiments, forgotten languages, forgotten minds. There's no rule that says this pattern can't fracture again, that it can't vanish again. Most human lineages did. Most memories did. Almost everything we ever were is already gone. The time hole wasn't an exception. It was the rule. So maybe the question isn't what happened then. It's how much of right now would still be here in 50,000 years if the servers failed, if the memory broke, if the recursion snapped again. Because if the last 100,000 years teach us anything, it's that the fire only burns if someone remembers how to light it.